Elliot Holloway's thick fingers closed around the back of Martha's chair and dragged it, with her still in it, 3 feet across the kitchen floor. The coffee cup she'd been holding hit the table edge and shattered across the floorboards. Nobody moved. Her 2 younger sisters stood near the stove, pretending to study the wallpaper. Her mother kept her eyes on the wash basin. "You're going," Elliot said, "and you're going to smile while you do it." Martha stared at the broken cup. There were 14 pieces. She counted them because it was easier than looking at her father. The man doesn't even know what he's agreeing to. He dropped a folded letter onto the table. But that's his problem once the papers are signed. If you've ever watched someone be sold like livestock by the very people supposed to protect them, stay with us. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what happens when the daughter everyone threw away becomes the one thing the frontier cannot survive without. Hit that like button and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it started. The letter had arrived on a Thursday, which Martha would later remember only because Thursday was the day she scrubbed the kitchen floor, and she'd been on her knees with a brush and bucket when she heard her father's boots on the porch steps. She recognized the sound before she saw him, heavier on the left foot since the mill accident 3 years back, a dragging rhythm she'd spent her childhood learning to read the way some children read weather. She didn't look up. Experience had taught her that looking up invited conversation, and conversation with Elliot Holloway rarely ended well for her. He came through the door and dropped into his chair at the head of the table. She heard the scratch of a match, smelled pipe smoke, and kept scrubbing the baseboards near the far wall. "There's a rancher up in Wyoming," he said, not to anyone in particular. "Name of Ashcroft. His wife died 2 winters back. He's looking." Martha's brush slowed for just a moment. She caught it, kept her rhythm even. "Looking for what?" her sister Delia asked from the doorway. Delia was 22 and pretty the way a new penny was pretty, bright and obvious and sharp at the edges. "A wife." Elliot turned the letter over in his hands. "Been writing to the matchmaker over in Carlisle. Wants someone capable." His words. Capable. Delia made a sound like she'd tasted something off. Capable. That's a word for horses. "Or for women who aren't much to look at," their mother said from the stove, and she didn't lower her voice to say it. Martha scrubbed the same 6 inches of baseboard 4 times. The wood was clean after the second pass. She just needed something to do with her hands. She was 28 years old and weighed 238 pounds, a fact she knew precisely because her father had announced it at dinner the previous Christmas. Announced it the way a man announces a crop failure, with a kind of exhausted disgust, as if the situation were slightly beyond his control, but mostly someone else's fault. She had been eating bread. She'd put it down and not picked it back up, and she hadn't eaten dinner that night, and nobody had noticed or mentioned it. She was not foolish enough to think she was beautiful. She'd stopped expecting that particular mercy from mirrors around age 15. What she had instead was a clear-eyed understanding of her own usefulness, which she suspected was more durable than beauty and considerably less comfortable to carry. She could lift a 50-pound feed sack without bracing herself. She could calculate seed ratios faster than any of the hired men her father kept. She could set a broken bone, stitch a wound clean, birth a calf in the dark in February, and make a meal from almost nothing that a man would ask for again. None of that had ever mattered to Elliot Holloway. What mattered to Elliot was appearance, because appearance was the currency of the social world he desperately wanted to belong to and never quite could. His 2 younger daughters were pretty. They were his admission tickets. Martha was the bill that kept coming due. "Send her," Delia said, and she was smiling. "If he wants capable, she's his answer." "He'll send her back," their mother said, "soon as he gets a look." "Maybe." Elliot folded the letter again. "But she'll be his problem by then, won't she?" Martha heard all of it, every word. She heard the casual cruelty of it the way you hear a familiar song, without surprise, with a kind of dull, bone-deep ache that she had learned long ago not to let reach her face. She finished the baseboard, stood up slowly, the way she always moved, deliberately, taking up no more space than necessary, which was itself a kind of practice she'd developed over years. She carried the bucket toward the back door. "Martha." Her father's voice stopped her at the threshold. She turned. He was looking at her the way you look at a problem you've been trying to solve for a long time. Not with hatred. That would have been easier. with the specific exhaustion of a man who had never figured out what to do with something he'd been handed that didn't fit anywhere. "You're 28, he said. "Yes, sir." "You're not getting younger." "No, sir." "Nobody here is going to offer for you. You know that." She held the bucket handle with both hands. The water inside was gray from the floor. "I know that. This man's got land, a working ranch. He's not asking for pretty. He's asking for capable," she said. "I heard." Something moved across his face. She couldn't have named it. It wasn't guilt. She wasn't sure her father had the wiring for guilt. Not where she was concerned. It was more like discomfort, the way a man looks when a reflection shows him something he'd rather not see. "I'll write back to the matchmaker," he said. Martha carried the bucket outside. She poured the gray water onto the frozen ground and watched it spread and sink and disappear, and she stood there in the cold for a while before she went back inside. She told herself she felt nothing. She almost managed to believe it. The matchmaker's name was Mrs. Gertrude Falk, and she operated out of a narrow office above a dry goods store in Carlisle, with the efficient cheerlessness of a woman who had arranged 47 marriages and believed in exactly none of them personally. Elliot took Martha there on a Tuesday. He told her to wear the blue dress, which was the best thing she owned, though it was 3 years old and tight across the shoulders in a way that made her walk carefully. She wore it without comment. Mrs. Falk looked at Martha the way a buyer looks at livestock, quickly, professionally, without visible judgment, which was almost worse than judgment. "He's written specific requirements," Mrs. Falk said, spreading papers across her desk. "He wants someone who can manage a household, work outdoors if necessary. He says," she adjusted her glasses, "he says he's not looking for companionship exactly. He's looking for a partner, his word, someone who can handle hard seasons." "She can handle hard seasons," Elliot said. Mrs. Falk looked at him, then at Martha. "Can you cook?" "Yes." "Can you handle livestock?" "Yes." "Have you ever worked through a winter in serious cold?" "Real cold, not—" "We lost the east pasture fence in the February storm 3 years ago," Martha said. "I rebuilt 40 feet of it with my brother before my father came back from Carlisle. Temperature was 6 degrees. Mrs. Falk's pen paused above her notepad. She studied Martha with an expression that was slightly different from the one she'd worn before. Still professional, but with something behind it. Interest, maybe. Or recognition. "He'll need to know your circumstances," Mrs. Falk said carefully. "Your physical circumstances." "He means your size," Elliot said. "I know what she means," Martha said. She looked at Mrs. Falk directly. "Tell him accurately. Tell him I'm a large woman. Tell him I'm strong and I work without complaint and I've never asked anyone to carry my share. If that's not what he wants, then it's better to say so now." Elliot stirred in his chair. "There's no need to—" "It's the sensible thing," Mrs. Falk said, and she was looking at Martha when she said it. "I'll write to Mr. Ashcroft this week." The response came 18 days later. Martha was in the barn when her father came to find her. She was splinting the foreleg of a young goat that had caught its foot in the fence, holding the animal steady between her knees while she wrapped the brace tight. It took concentration. She didn't look up when she heard the door. "He wrote back," Elliot said. She kept wrapping. "He says he accepts the arrangement." She tied off the wrap, held the goat a moment longer while it calmed, then set it gently on its feet. It tested the splinted leg, hobbled, steadied. "He knows?" she asked. Mrs. Falk told him what she told him. "He knows I'm large." "She said she described your circumstances." Martha picked up the remaining bandage and rolled it. "And he still accepted." "He's either desperate or stupid," Elliot said. "Probably both." She didn't answer that. She walked the goat to its pen, latched the gate, and then stood at the fence looking at the animal for a moment. "When do I leave?" she asked. 2 weeks. Train from Carlisle. He'll meet you in Laramie." 2 weeks. She had 2 weeks to prepare for a life she couldn't picture with a man she'd never met in a place she'd never been. She thought she should feel frightened. She examined herself carefully and found something that surprised her. Something closer to relief. The specific, complicated relief of a person who has been waiting for something to change and finally hears the first creak of a hinge. She went back to the barn and kept working. The morning she left, her sister stood on the porch and watched. Delia had her arms crossed. The younger one, Patience, 14 and not yet cruel, stood slightly apart from the others with an expression that might have been something genuine. Martha couldn't tell from the wagon. Her mother handed her a cloth bundle at the door. Inside was a jar of preserves and a pair of wool socks. No embrace. No particular warmth in the handing over, but Martha took it without comment and tucked it into her bag. Elliot drove her to the station. They did not speak for the first mile. The road was rutted from the recent freeze and the wagon rocked steadily. Martha held her bag in her lap and watched the fields go by. Gray and flat and familiar, the landscape she had looked at her whole life without ever quite feeling that it belonged to her. "You understand what's expected," her father said. Not a question. "I understand. He's got a working ranch. You keep it going, you keep him satisfied, he's got no reason to send you back." He paused. "If he sends you back, he won't." Elliot glanced at her. Something shifted in his face, a brief uncertainty, as if he'd just heard a tone in her voice he hadn't catalogued before. "You sound sure." "I am." They rode the rest of the way in silence. On the platform, he handed her bag up to her. She climbed down from the wagon, and he didn't help her, and she didn't expect him to. She stood with her bag and her ticket and looked at her father sitting in the wagon with the reins loose in his hands. She thought about saying something. She turned it over in her mind for a moment. Some statement that would hold the weight of everything she'd never said. All those years of counted pieces of broken crockery and half-eaten meals and rebuilt fence posts in 6-degree cold. All of it. She decided against it. Not because she was afraid, but because she suddenly couldn't think of a single sentence that would make him understand, and she was tired of trying. "Goodbye," she said. "Don't embarrass the family," he said. She turned and walked to the platform without looking back. The train ride took 2 days. She sat in a window seat and watched the landscape change. The flat fields giving way to longer distances. The sky opening up. The country turning rougher and more honest-looking as they moved west. She ate the bread and dried meat she'd packed, drank water from the conductor's cart, and slept in short stretches with her bag tucked against her side. She thought about Rowan Ashcroft. She'd been given very little to work with. His letter to Mrs. Falk had been brief, practical language, short sentences, no attempt at charm. He had listed what he needed the way a man lists what he needs from a hardware store. Useful, she thought. At least he was honest about it. She tried to build a picture of him and couldn't quite manage it. She knew he was 41. She knew his wife had died in the winter 2 years back. Mrs. Falk had said pneumonia, had said it quickly, as if the details weren't hers to share. She knew he ran cattle. She knew the ranch was called Blackstone and sat on several hundred acres of Wyoming range. She did not know what he looked like, what he sounded like, whether he was a quiet man or a loud one, whether he was the kind who ran cold or the kind who ran hot. She did not know whether he was kind. She had been in situations in her life where kindness was not available, and she had learned to work without it. She hoped for it, the way you hope for good weather, without betting anything important on it. The train reached Laramie in the late afternoon of the second day. She stepped onto the platform with her bag and her wrapped bundle from her mother and stood in the cold air while other passengers moved around her. The platform was busy. Men with freight, women with children, a couple arguing about a trunk near the far stairs. She scanned the crowd methodically, the way she did most things. A man was standing at the far end of the platform, apart from the crowd, holding his hat in his hands and watching the arrivals with an expression she couldn't read at this distance. He was tall, not remarkably, but solidly. Dark coat, worn at the elbows. He had a scar that ran from his left jaw down the side of his neck, visible even from where she stood, and he wasn't attempting to hide it, which told her something. His face was the kind that had been worked on by weather for a long time. He was watching the arrivals with a steady patience that wasn't relaxed exactly. More like a man who had learned to wait without it costing him anything. Their eyes met across 30 feet of platform. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then he walked toward her. He replaced his hat as he walked, and she noticed he moved like a man accustomed to uneven ground, steady, deliberate, never rushing. He came to a stop about 3 feet away and looked at her directly, the way people almost never did. Not at her face and then quickly away. Not that assessing sweep down and up that she'd learned to brace for. Directly at her, the way you look at a person you're actually trying to understand. "Miss Holloway," he said. "Mr. Ashcroft." "How was the ride?" "Long," she said. "Fine. A pause. He looked at her bag. That everything you brought? Yes. All right. He reached for the bag. She held it a moment before releasing it, not from stubbornness, from instinct, the reflex of someone who had always carried their own things. He noticed. He took the bag without comment and turned toward the stairs. Wagon's out front, he said. Takes about 2 hours to the ranch. We'll stop for supplies before we leave town. She fell into step beside him. They walked through the platform crowd and out into the street, where a sturdy bay horse stood hitched to a working wagon. Nothing fancy, everything functional. The wagon bed held an empty grain sack and a worn rope and a pair of fence pliers, and she thought that told her more about him than anything Mrs. Falk had written. He helped her up into the wagon. She accepted the help, which cost her something, and took her place on the seat. They drove to the general store in something that wasn't quite silence and wasn't quite conversation. He mentioned the weather, she asked about road conditions. He said there'd been a freeze 2 nights back and the creek crossing at the South Road was icy but passable. Practical exchange. She was comfortable with practical exchange. It was the ornamental kind she'd never had much use for. At the store he bought flour, salt, coffee, a length of rope, and 3 pounds of nails. She stood beside him at the counter and noticed that the storekeeper knew him by name and spoke to him with the shorthand of long familiarity. He didn't introduce her, and she didn't expect him to. They weren't married yet, and small-town introductions had a way of compounding into something complicated. On the way back to the wagon, a woman passing on the boardwalk did a visible double-take. Looked at Martha, then at Rowan, then at Martha, again, with an expression that had several things in it. Surprise. A kind of entertained disbelief. Martha had seen that expression or something like it her entire life. She kept walking. Rowan said nothing. She wasn't sure whether he'd noticed. They got back in the wagon and headed north out of Laramie into the open range. The sun was going down behind the mountains, painting the sky in colors that would have been beautiful if Martha had been in the habit of noticing such things. She noticed them anyway, despite herself. The ranch hands know you're coming, Rowan said after a while. 6 of them. 2 are year-rounders, rest are seasonal. They're good workers. They won't give you trouble. I'm not worried about trouble. He glanced at her. Most women would be. I've managed workers before. My father's hired men. That's different from a ranch crew. I imagine it's not entirely different. Another silence. The horse moved steadily. The cold was deepening around them. The house needs work, he said. I've kept it functional, but I'm not... He paused, and she had the sense he was being careful, choosing words that were honest without being more than he intended to offer. I'm not a man who pays attention to details indoors. The kitchen's solid. The stove works. The rest of it I've let go. I can manage a house? I know. He said it simply, without flattery. Mrs. Falk told me what you said in her office, about rebuilding the fence. Martha looked at him. She wrote it in her letter, he said. I thought it was worth knowing. She didn't have to include that. No, but she did. He was quiet a moment. I think she wanted me to understand what I was getting. Martha turned that over. And what did you understand? He didn't answer immediately. The wagon rolled over a rough patch, both of them bracing slightly without thought. That you weren't going to be a problem I had to manage, he said finally. That you could carry your own weight. It was the most completely neutral thing anyone had ever said to her. No cruelty in it. No flattery either. Just a straight assessment of a working reality, offered directly, as if he saw absolutely nothing unusual about it. She felt something in her chest do a small, complicated thing that she filed away to examine later. That's accurate, she said. Good, he said. Then we understand each other. They reached the ranch in full dark, the lantern light from the bunkhouse showing orange through the cold air. She saw the outline of a large barn, a main house with a covered porch, several outbuildings arranged in the practical geometry of a working operation. Nothing decorative. Everything where it needed to be. He helped her down from the wagon. A ranch hand came out of the bunkhouse. Young, maybe 20, hat in his hands. This is Dale, Rowan said. He'll put up the horse. Dale nodded at Martha with the quick, neutral respect of someone who had been told to be respectful and had decided to actually mean it. Ma'am. Thank you, Dale, she said. Rowan carried her bag to the house. Inside was the smell of wood smoke and old coffee and the specific mustiness of a space maintained by a man living alone. The kitchen was big, the stove solid and well seasoned, The table heavy oak with 4 chairs, only one of which showed signs of regular use. She looked around with the assessing eye of someone who has spent her whole life calculating what a space needs. He set her bag down near the hallway. Room's at the end. I'm across the hall. He stopped. Started again with the deliberate care of someone navigating ground they hadn't mapped. The arrangement Mrs. Falk described. I want to be honest. I don't have expectations beyond what was agreed. A working partnership. I mean that. She looked at him. The scar caught the lamplight on the left side of his face. He was watching her with that same direct steadiness she'd noticed on the platform, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she trusted it. Not because she was naive, she had not survived 28 years in her father's house by being naive, but because there was something in his face that was completely unperforming. No angle, no show, just a man trying to say a true thing. I understand the arrangement, she said. I have no expectations beyond my own share of the work. He nodded once. There's coffee on the stove if you want it. Breakfast is at 5:30. The hands eat in the bunkhouse, but you're welcome to eat there or here, your choice. Here's fine. He turned toward the hallway and then paused. Miss Holloway. Martha, she said. He turned back. Martha, he corrected. Welcome to Blackstone. He said it without ceremony, without performance, like a man who had been living alone long enough that courtesy had lost its decorative quality and become purely functional. She thought it was the most genuine welcome she'd ever received. She unpacked her bag in the small room at the end of the hall, hanging her spare dress on the nail behind the door and placing her mother's jar of preserves on the windowsill. The wool socks she put at the bottom of the drawer. She sat on the edge of the bed for a moment in the dark, not sleeping, not quite thinking, just listening to the quiet, the different quality of Wyoming quiet, which was wider than anything she'd known. No sisters moving overhead, no father's heavy footfall on the boards below, just wind and distance and the faint sound of the horse settling in the barn. She realized she hadn't felt her shoulders this low in years. She lay down in her clothes and was asleep in 3 minutes. The first morning, she woke at 4:15 without an alarm. She'd always been an early riser, which her father had taken credit for teaching her, and which she'd been born with. The kitchen was cold. She got the stove going, found the coffee tin, filled the pot. She went through the pantry while it heated, making a quiet inventory: flour, salt, dried beans, some smoked pork, a half-empty jar of lard, potatoes that needed using, onions. Modest but workable. She had biscuits in the oven and the coffee ready and 2 pans of eggs moving when she heard Rowan come down the hall at 5:15. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. He was dressed already, coat on, hat in hand, and his expression when he looked at the stove was the expression of a man who has been woken out of a habit they'd forgotten they were in. You didn't have to do this, he said. I know. She slid the biscuits out. Sit down. He sat. She poured his coffee and set the biscuits and eggs in front of him, and then poured her own cup and sat across the table at the chair that was not his. He waited a moment, and she wasn't sure for what, and then he picked up a biscuit and bit into it. He looked at his plate, then at her. These are good, he said. Thank you. A pause. My wife used to burn them, he said, and the words came out with the careful tone of a man testing the weight of something before putting it down. She was better at other things. Martha studied her coffee. What things? She was good with numbers, kept the books better than I ever could. He turned the biscuit in his hands. She hated the cold. She came from Georgia. He stopped. She never suited the frontier. She tried, but it wore on her. Martha didn't say she was sorry because the feeling had something more complicated in it than that simple phrase could hold, and she suspected he'd been given that phrase enough times that it had stopped carrying much. What kind of books? She asked instead. He looked at her. Ledgers, ranch accounts, cattle sales, feed costs, labor. I can do that. A beat. You keep books? I kept my father's accounts from the time I was 16. He didn't trust the hired man with numbers, and he didn't want to do it himself. She drank her coffee. I can set up a system if you show me what you have. He looked at her for a long moment with that expression she was beginning to recognize. Not quite surprised, something more considered than that. Like a man who has made a calculation and gotten a different answer than he expected. After the morning feeding, he said, I'll show you the ledgers. She nodded. And that was how it started. Not with ceremony or declaration, but with biscuits and coffee and a practical agreement at a kitchen table in the cold Wyoming dawn. Two people who had both been handed difficult lives choosing, without saying so, to be useful to each other. Outside, Dale came across the yard from the bunkhouse. She heard his boots on the frozen ground, the familiar sounds of a working morning beginning. She got up and started clearing the plates. "Leave them," Rowan said. She paused. "I'll do them," he said. "You already cooked." She looked at him. He was being serious. She sat back down and finished her coffee, and the simple strangeness of it, of being in a kitchen where she didn't have to do everything, was something she had to sit very quietly inside for a moment before she could put it down and move on with the day. The ledgers were a disaster, not maliciously, the kind of disaster that happens when a capable man who hates paperwork has spent 2 years making entries in whatever order struck him, with no consistent system, some pages dated, some not, cattle records mixed with supply costs, mixed with labor payments in handwriting that tilted increasingly left as the entries got later in the evening. Martha sat at the table with them for 2 hours while Rowan was out with the hands for the morning feeding. She didn't reorganize anything. She just read through all of it, page by page, until she understood his system, or rather the shape of what he'd intended his system to be before it had gotten away from him. When he came back at mid-morning, she had a list. "I can fix this," she said. "I'll need a new ledger, 2 new ones. And I'll need you to sit with me for about an hour so I understand what these entries mean. Some of them I can guess, some of them I can't." He looked at her list. He looked at the ledgers spread across the table. He looked at her list again. "What's the number?" he said. "What number?" "You've been through them 2 hours. What's the number?" She understood what he was asking. She'd run it in her head twice. "You're short about $40 from where you should be at this point in the season, based on what I can reconstruct. But I think 2 of the cattle sale entries from last fall are recorded wrong. Not fraudulently, just transposed. If I'm right, you're actually $12 over." He stared at her. "I could be wrong," she said. "I need that hour with you to be sure." He pulled out a chair and sat down across the table. "Let's do it now," he said. They spent 90 minutes going through the entries line by line. She asked questions in the flat, specific way she'd always ask questions. Not apologetically, not hedging, just exactly what she needed to know. He answered in the same register. By the time they were finished, she'd confirmed the transposed entries and found a third error she hadn't expected. A feed cost recorded twice. "You're $14 over," she said, "not 12. He sat back in his chair. He looked at the ledger, then at her. "You did that in your head," he said. "I do most things in my head." "Where did you learn that?" "My father's farm. Before that, school until I was 14. Numbers made sense to me in a way other things didn't." He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the directness she was beginning to identify as his default mode. "I had a man doing the books before. Hired accountant from Laramie. He didn't find that." She looked at the ledger. He was probably going in order. The second entry was on a page 6 weeks before the first one. Easy to miss if you're moving linearly. "I paid him $4 for the season. That's too much for what you got." Something shifted in his face. He put his hand over his mouth for a moment, and she realized with some surprise that he was suppressing a laugh. "I suppose it is," he said. It was the first time she'd seen anything like lightness in him. It changed his face. Not completely, not enough to make it easy, but enough to show her the outline of something that might be humor, buried under a lot of weather and hard seasons. She found she wanted to see it again. She went back to the ledger. "I'll have this organized by end of week," she said. "And I'll set up a system going forward that you can maintain yourself if I'm not—" She stopped. "That's maintainable." He noticed the stop. He didn't comment on it. "Thank you," he said. And he meant it. Not perfunctorily, not as a closing phrase, but the way you thank someone when they've done something that actually matters. She nodded and gathered the ledgers into a neat stack. Outside one of the hands, a compact, weathered man named Gus, who had been running cattle since before Rowan was born, was coming across the yard. She'd met him briefly that morning. He'd looked at her the way most of the hands had looked at her, with the careful neutrality of men who had been told to behave and were reserving full judgment. "Boss," Gus said from the doorway, "that heifer in the east pasture is down. Looks like she's trying to calve, and the calves turned. Rowan was on his feet before Gus finished. He reached for his coat. "I'll come," Martha said. Rowan looked at her. "I've helped breech calves before," she said. "More than once." He held her gaze for a moment, then, to Gus, "Get the rope." She was already pulling on her coat. The heifer was in this far corner of the east pasture, down on her side in the frozen mud, sides heaving with the effort of labor that was going wrong. Martha had seen this before. The particular distress of an animal whose body was working against itself. She crossed the pasture at a pace that wasn't quite running and wasn't quite walking, and she reached the animal before either of the two hands who'd come with them. She knelt in the frozen mud without hesitating, felt the animal's side, felt the positioning. "Calf's hindquarters first," she said. "We need to rotate." One of the hands, young, maybe Dale's age, made a sound that might have been skepticism. Gus said nothing. Rowan crouched on the other side of the heifer. "Tell me what you need," he said. She told him. He did what she asked without question, holding the animal steady while she worked with a steady, unhurried focus. Her hands were strong and careful, and she'd done this in the dark in February, in worse conditions than these, and it was not graceful work, and it was not fast, but it was correct. And 13 minutes after she'd knelt in the mud, the calf came into the cold air, and she cleared its airway and held it, while the heifer turned and found it. She sat back on her heels. The calf blinked. The mother huffed and nosed at it, and the small, essential drama of survival continued without reference to the humans who'd helped it along. She looked up. Gus was looking at her with an expression that was different from the one he'd worn that morning. The young hand's skeptical sound had gone somewhere. Rowan was watching her with the quiet, careful attention she'd begun to recognize as his version of speaking. "Let's get her up before she stiffens," she said. She stood, and her knees were cold and her hands were covered in blood and mud, and nobody said anything about it, and they worked together to get the heifer on her feet. And by the time they walked back across the pasture, the sun was getting low, and the cold was hard, and the calf was standing on shaking legs in the east corner of the field. At the fence gate, Gus fell into step beside her. "Where'd you learn that?" he said. "Home," she said. He nodded once. That was the entirety of the conversation. But something in the way he nodded told her it was a different kind of silence than the one from this morning. She walked back to the house. She washed her hands at the pump in the yard. She started dinner. She thought about her father's voice saying, "He'll send you back." She thought, "No, he won't." Not with any particular triumph, just the quiet, certain knowledge of someone who had finally found ground solid enough to stand on. The calf lived. Martha knew because she checked on it the next morning before the rest of the ranch was fully awake, crossing the frost-hard ground in the dark with a lantern, letting herself into the east pasture quietly so as not to startle the heifer. The calf was on its feet, nursing, its small frame still uncertain but present and working. She stood at the fence for a few minutes watching it, and then she went back to the house and started the stove. That was how the first week went, not in dramatic gestures or declarations, but in small accumulations. Biscuits and ledgers and a calf in a frozen pasture. Each morning she rose before the house and had coffee going before Rowan came down the hall, and each morning he sat at the table and drank it without making a ceremony of it, which was exactly what she wanted. The ranch hands were another matter. There were 6 of them, as Rowan had said. Gus, who was the oldest and functioned as a kind of unofficial foreman without the title. Dale, who was 20 and eager in the way of young men who haven't yet learned to pace themselves. A quiet Mexican hand named Ernesto, who spoke limited English, but communicated most things adequately through expression and gesture. 2 brothers from Kansas named Carl and Pete Briggs, who had the synchronized movements of men who'd worked together their whole lives. And a lean, watchful man called Hitch, whose actual name was apparently something else, though nobody used it. Gus had shifted after the calving. Not dramatically. He wasn't a dramatic man, but she felt it in the way he spoke to her, the way he addressed her questions directly instead of looking to Rowan first. The others were still in a kind of suspended assessment. She didn't push it. She understood that trust among working people was built through accumulated evidence and not through any single event, no matter how significant, and she was patient in the way of someone who has spent decades earning things that other people simply received. What she hadn't anticipated was Hitch. He was the one who held out longest, and he held out in the specific way of a man who has developed a philosophy about something and intends to maintain it. He wasn't hostile, not openly. He was careful, courteous in the mechanical way of someone who has been told what is expected and is technically complying. But there was an edge in him when he spoke to her, a very slight emphasis on certain words, a tendency to look slightly past her rather than at her. She noticed it on the fourth day. She'd come out to the barn to check on a draft horse that had been favoring its left foreleg. She'd noticed it the day before and mentioned it to Rowan, who'd said he'd get to it. She'd gone out in the afternoon when she had a break between the kitchen work and the evening meal, not because she'd been asked to, but because the horse was bothering her. Hitch was in the barn. He looked up when she came in, and his expression did the thing it always did. That fractional adjustment, the careful return to neutral. "I'm just checking the horse," she said. "Rowan's got it on the list for tomorrow," he said. "I know." She moved past him toward the stall. "I want to look at it today." A pause behind her. Then, "It's a working barn, Mrs. Ashcroft." She wasn't Mrs. Ashcroft yet. The papers hadn't been signed, wouldn't be for another 2 weeks when the circuit judge came through. But she let that go. She opened the stall gate and ran her hand down the horse's leg from knee to fetlock, feeling for heat, for swelling. The horse stood for it, which told her the leg wasn't in acute pain. "It's a stone bruise," she said, "not a tendon. He needs a poultice and 2 days out of the rotation." "Hitch turned that horse out this morning," Hitch said from behind her, with something in his voice she recognized, the flat, careful tone of a man who doesn't like being corrected. She stood up. She turned and looked at him directly. "I'm not saying you did something wrong. A stone bruise isn't obvious until you know what you're feeling for. I'm saying I know what it is now, and he needs 2 days." Hitch looked at her. The looking had a quality to it. Not quite a challenge, but testing something, the way you press on a surface to find out where it gives. "I'll mention it to Rowan," he said. "Mention what to Rowan?" Rowan said. Neither of them had heard him come in. He was in the doorway with his hat pushed back and the look of a man who had been listening for at least part of the conversation. Hitch straightened. "The bay's leg. She says stone bruise, 2 days out." Rowan looked at Martha. "Feel here," she said, gesturing to the spot on the leg. "You'll feel the heat's localized. If it were a tendon issue, it'd run different." He came into the stall and crouched where she indicated and felt the horse's leg. He was quiet for a moment. "2 days," he said. He stood. He looked at Hitch. "Take him out of rotation." Hitch nodded. No argument. He moved to do it. Rowan looked at Martha. Not a complicated look. Just the steady, direct regard that was his default. He didn't say anything, and she didn't need him to, and they both left the barn. At the doorway he said quietly, not stopping, "He'll come around." "I know," she said. "They usually do." He glanced at her sideways. "You've dealt with this before." "I've spent my life dealing with people who didn't think I was supposed to be in a room," she said. "I've gotten comfortable waiting them out." He looked at her for a moment. Something crossed his face that she might have called respect, except that word felt too formal for what it was. Something more personal, something that had been slowly assembling itself over the past 4 days. "Dinner's in an hour," she said, and went back to the house. The night of the 8th day, the temperature dropped to something the hands referred to with the specific shorthand of frontier cold. Not cold or very cold, but the kind that gets into the boards. She'd heard Gus say it at supper and understood from context. She woke at 2 in the morning because the house had a sound it hadn't had before. A creak, and then a groan from the east side that was structural, the sound of wood contracting fast, and then silence that felt different from ordinary silence. She lay still for a moment, listening. Then she heard Dale shouting from the yard. She was in her boots and coat before Rowan came out of his room. She was through the kitchen and out the back door before he finished lacing his left boot. She ran across the frozen ground toward the shouting, which was coming from the direction of the main barn, and when she got there she understood the sound she'd heard from her bed. The east wall of the barn was bowing inward. The weight of the ice buildup on the roof had been accumulating for 3 days, and the east wall, older than the rest, she'd noticed the weathering on the boards the first week, had begun to fail. Inside the barn were 9 horses, including the 3 primary working animals Rowan couldn't afford to lose. Dale was at the barn door, pulling at it, and it was jammed. The frame had shifted with the wall, pinching the door in its housing. He was a strong kid, but he was panicking, and panic was making him inefficient. "Dale." She put her hand on his arm. "Stop. Let me." He stepped back, breathing hard. She looked at the door frame. The wood had warped inward at the top right corner, pinching the door diagonally. She needed to lift and pull simultaneously. She braced her feet wide on the frozen ground, got both hands on the door's upper edge, and put her full weight and strength into it. Not a jerk, a sustained twisting pull that lifted the door frame a fraction of an inch and broke its bind. The door swung open. The horses inside were moving, whites of their eyes showing, the specific terror of animals trapped in a failing space. She went in without thinking about it, because there wasn't time for thinking about it, only for doing. From the back, she called over her shoulder to Dale. Move them from the back, push them toward me. I'll get them out. She heard Rowan's voice behind her and Gus behind him, and then she stopped tracking voices because she was inside with 9 frightened horses, and the east wall was groaning, and there was only the work. She knew horses the way she knew most animals, not from formal training, but from years of proximity, from having spent more comfortable time in barns than in sitting rooms. She moved through them with her voice steady and her hands calm and her body low and deliberate, and one by one the horses moved toward the door, and one by one they went through. The 7th horse was a gray draft animal she hadn't worked with before, 17 hands and in full panic, and when she moved toward it, it kicked out, and she caught the edge of the hoof on her left forearm and went down sideways into the straw. She heard someone shout her name. She got her knees under her and stood up and finished moving the horse toward the door. 8. 9. She came out last. The east wall came in 20 seconds later. The crash was enormous in the winter quiet, a long tearing sound and then impact that shook the ground. She was standing 10 feet away with her hand pressed to her forearm, and she felt the vibration through the soles of her boots. Silence. Then the sound of 9 horses breathing in the cold dark. Rowan was at her side before she'd finished standing fully. His hands went to her arms, looking for what was wrong, and she said, "I'm fine," and meant it approximately. The forearm hurt considerably, but it was functional. She could tell from the way it moved. "You went down," he said. His voice was different. The careful steadiness was still there, but underneath it was something she hadn't heard before, an urgency, something tight. "The gray kicked me. It's a bruise, not a break. I went down and got back up." He held her arm carefully, feeling along the bone the same way she'd felt the horse's leg in the stall 4 days ago. His hands were very warm in the cold air. She let him check without pulling away, not from passivity, but because it was the right thing to do in the circumstances, and she recognized a man who needed to confirm something for his own peace of mind. "It's not broken," she said. "I know," he said, but he didn't let go immediately. Gus was counting the horses. Dale was standing near the collapsed wall with his hat off, staring at the wreckage. Ernesto was talking quietly to the gray, which was still trembling. Carl and Pete Briggs had appeared from somewhere and were beginning to secure the horses to the fence rail. Hitch was standing near the back fence. I was looking at Martha, not in the calculating way she'd grown accustomed to from him. Something different. He looked away when she caught it, but she'd seen it clearly enough. The expression of a man reassessing an estimate he'd been confident in. "We need to get them into the west barn," she said. "It's smaller, but it'll hold them for tonight. We can figure out shelter tomorrow." "West barn's already got the cattle," Gus said. "Then we shift 2 cattle into the south run and put the horses in the space. It's cold, but they'll share heat." Gus looked at Rowan. Rowan nodded. And they did it, all of them working in the dark and the cold, and by the time the horses were settled and the cattle rearranged and the south fence checked for the night, it was past 4 in the morning and the temperature had dropped again. In the kitchen afterward, she boiled water and wrapped her arm in a hot compress and sat at the table with her coffee and let herself feel the pain properly, since there hadn't been time before. It was significant. She had learned over the years to defer pain, to set it in a kind of internal holding space until there was room for it, and this was the moment to let it arrive. The kitchen door opened. Rowan came in. He looked at her arm. He looked at her face. "Is it worse than you said?" "No, it's exactly what I said." He pulled out a chair and sat across the table. He did not pour himself coffee. He just sat. "You went in before anyone else," he said. The door was jammed. "Martha." He said her name with a particular weight. "You didn't hesitate." She looked at him. Hesitating wasn't going to open the door faster. 9 horses, he said. East wall coming in. Most people would have waited. And then what? Lost the horses? He looked at his hands on the table. He was quiet for a moment in the way she'd come to recognize as actual thought rather than pause. I watched you from the doorway, he said. For maybe a minute before I came in, I was watching how you moved in there. She waited. I've had working partners before, he said. Men, good hands, and not one of them moved through those horses the way you did. He looked up. You weren't afraid. I was afraid, she said. I just moved anyway. He looked at her for a long moment. His face in the lamplight had the worn, specific quality of a man carrying considerable history. Not all of it bad, but all of it heavy. The scar along his jaw caught the light in a way that made it look less like damage and more like topography, just part of the map of him. I need to tell you something, he said. She waited. When I wrote to Mrs. Falk, he said slowly, I want to be honest with you. I wasn't expecting anything beyond functional. A warm body in the house, someone to keep things from falling further apart. He stopped, started again. I wrote the letter because the ranch was getting away from me and I needed help and I didn't have another option. She didn't say anything. She kept her face still and her breathing even. I wasn't thinking about what I was asking of someone. I didn't think much about what it would mean for the person. He looked at his hands again. Your father wrote back to Mrs. Falk before she wrote to me. Did she tell you that? Martha's hand tightened very slightly around her coffee cup. No, she said. He described you as… Rowan stopped. He pressed his lips together briefly. He was not generous in the description. I don't want to repeat what he wrote. She thought of her father at the kitchen table with the letter. She thought of his voice. He'll send her back. She'll be his problem by then. I can guess, she said. I'm sure you can. He looked at her directly. I want you to know that I read it and I thought, this man doesn't know his own daughter. Whatever he was describing, it wasn't what Mrs. Falk wrote me about. And it certainly wasn't what you've been since you came here. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind was pushing at the boards. You don't have to say that, she said. Her voice was steady. She needed it to be steady. I know I don't have to. He said it with the blunt simplicity that was his defining characteristic. I'm saying it because it's true, and it seemed important that you hear it. She looked down at her coffee. There was a feeling in her chest that was not comfortable, a kind of pressure, warm and complicated, the feeling of something that had been compressed for a very long time, beginning to find room to expand. She was not accustomed to it, and she didn't entirely trust it, and she sat with it carefully for a moment before looking back up. Thank you, she said. It was inadequate. She knew it was inadequate. She said it anyway. He nodded once. He got up and poured himself the coffee he hadn't poured before. He came back to the table. They sat together in the kitchen in the early morning dark, drinking coffee, not talking, while outside the cold worked at the ground and 9 horses breathed in a barn that was too small for them, and the east wall lay in a pile of boards that would need dealing with at first light. It was, she thought, one of the most companionable silences she had ever sat in. The east wall took 4 days to rebuild, which was faster than it should have taken, because Martha organized the effort. She'd built fence and repaired buildings before, but not at this scale, and she approached it the way she approached the ledgers, with a clear, assessing eye and a practical system. She mapped what was salvageable in the collapsed wall and what needed replacing, calculated what lumber they had on hand against what would need to come from town, and put together a materials list the morning after the collapse that Rowan took to the Laramie hardware store without modification. The hands worked the rebuild in the margins around their regular duties. 2 hours in the morning before the cattle, 2 hours in the evening after. She worked alongside them, not directing from a distance, but physically there, hauling boards and holding beams while the nails went in and working the difficult angles where the new wall met the old framing. It was on the 3rd day of the rebuild that Hitch came to stand beside her at the lumber pile. She was sorting boards by length, which was not complicated work, but it required attention because the lengths looked similar until you put them side by side. She heard him come up and continued sorting. You measured this section wrong, he said. She stopped, looked at the board in her hand, looked at the space it was meant for, measured the space with her eye, then with the rope measure she kept in her coat pocket. She had measured it wrong by about 2 inches, which was enough to matter. You're right, she said. He didn't say anything for a moment. She thought he'd been expecting an argument. I do that sometimes, she said. When I'm moving fast, I skip a verification. He picked up the end of the next board she'd sorted and looked at it. This one's right, he said. Good. They worked side by side for a while without talking. Then he said, in the flattened tone of a man trying to say something and not quite willing to fully commit to it, I've been on this ranch 3 years. I know. Rowan's a fair man. I found that to be true. A pause. I wasn't, he started, stopped. I wasn't easy with you coming. I noticed, she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them made a performance of it. The horses, he said. What you did. The door was jammed, she said again, because it was still true. I know what I saw, he said. And he said it with a kind of finality, not as a statement of what she'd done, but as a statement of something he'd decided, as if whatever judgment he'd been holding in reserve had been weighed against available evidence, and he'd come to a conclusion. He picked up a board and carried it to the frame. She picked up another and followed. They didn't discuss it again. They didn't need to. By the time the circuit judge came through to formalize the marriage papers, the East Barn wall was rebuilt, and the main ledger was reorganized into 2 clean volumes with a system any literate person could follow, and the gray draft horse had lost his tendency to kick at unfamiliar handlers because she'd spent 20 minutes a day with him for the past week and a half, not doing anything in particular, just being there until familiar became normal. The judge was a small, tidy man named Harwick, who arrived on a Tuesday with mud on his boots and an efficient manner that suggested he'd done this particular service many times and had no strong feelings about it either way. He sat at the kitchen table with his papers and his pen and looked at them both over the tops of his glasses. Any objections to the terms as written? No, Rowan said. No, Martha said. Any questions about your respective obligations under the law of the territory? No, they both said, at almost the same moment. Harwick looked at them both for a moment. You've already worked this out. We've been managing fine, Rowan said. So I hear. Harwick made a note. Mrs. Fincher at the dry goods in Laramie mentioned you'd come through, said you were efficient. He said this without particular inflection, but he was looking at Martha when he said it, and there was something in his expression that was drier than his tone. Mrs. Fincher told me the flour was good value, Martha said. Harwick made another note. Sign here and here. They signed. Harwick witnessed. He sealed it, pocketed the documents, accepted a cup of coffee and declined supper, and was back on his horse within 40 minutes. Rowan stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him ride out. Martha was already at the stove. That's done then, Rowan said. Yes. He came in. He sat at the table. He looked at the table for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not unhappy, not particularly anything, just the look of a man in the presence of a fact that is larger than he'd expected. I should tell you, he said, that the last 2 weeks have been… He stopped, pushed on. The ranch has run better than it has in 2 years. I want you to know that I know that. And that it's not just the ledgers or the cooking or any single thing. It's the whole of it. She turned from the stove. She looked at him. I've been trying to figure out how to say that without it sounding like I'm talking about a hired hand, he said. Because it's not that. She waited. It's that I'd forgotten what it was like to have someone in this place who gave a damn about it. He said the last part quickly, as if he'd been holding it for a while and needed to release it before he thought better of it. Not just doing the job, actually caring. The stove popped behind her. Outside, Dale was shouting something to Ernesto about the water trough. I care about things I'm part of, she said simply. It's how I'm built. He looked at her. I know, he said. I've been watching. She turned back to the stove, and she was careful not to let him see her face for a moment, because her face was doing something she hadn't given it permission to do, and she preferred to manage that privately. It was in the 4th week that the real test came, and it didn't arrive from the direction she'd been expecting. She'd been expecting the work, the brutal, cumulative weight of frontier labor in the teeth of Wyoming winter, the way it piled up without pause or apology. She'd been expecting loneliness, the specific variety that comes from being in a new place among people you're still learning. She'd been expecting to prove herself repeatedly, because that had been the pattern of her entire adult life. What she hadn't expected was Rowan's knee. He didn't mention it. She noticed it first on a Tuesday, watching him cross the yard. A very slight unevenness in his right leg, a controlled compensation in his hip, that spoke of something that had been managed for a long time. She watched it for 2 more days before she said anything, by which point she'd observed enough to know it was worse in the cold and worse in the morning, and that he favored it most severely on the days after heavy physical work. "Your knee," she said, on Thursday evening, while he was sitting at the table going over the week's cattle figures. He looked up. His expression shifted by about 1 millimeter, which for him was the equivalent of visible discomfort. "It's manageable," he said. "I didn't ask if it was manageable. I said your knee." He looked at the papers. "Old injury. I took a bad fall from a horse about 5 years back. It set badly. The cold gets into it." "Have you had anyone look at it?" "A doctor in Laramie, twice. He said there wasn't much to do." She studied him. He was looking at the papers with the determined focus of a man who wants to close a subject. "I can wrap it," she said. "There's a technique. My father broke his ankle 3 winters ago, and the doctor showed me how to support the joint so it doesn't grind. It wouldn't fix the underlying problem, but it would make the mornings easier." He didn't say anything. "It would take about 10 minutes, she said. "If you want." A long pause. "All right," he said. She got the cloth strips she'd been using for the gray horse's leg wrapping. She'd kept extra, and came back to the table. He'd extended his leg and was looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man who has agreed to something and is committed to not regretting it. She knelt beside his chair and began working. The joint was visibly swollen on the interior side, thickened with old damage, and she could feel the irregularity in it even through the cloth of his pants. She wrapped it the way she'd been taught, with even tension and a specific crossing pattern at the kneecap that distributed the compression. He didn't say anything while she worked. His breathing was even and controlled. She was close enough to him that she could hear it. "There," she said. She tied off the wrap. "How does that feel?" He pressed his foot to the floor, stood carefully, walked to the doorway and back. He stopped in front of her and looked down at her with the expression she'd come to know best from him, the one that was almost nothing on the surface and considerably more beneath it. "Better," he said. "Good." He didn't move immediately. She was aware of the kitchen around them, the fire, the lamplight, the winter dark pressing at the windows. He was close, and the closeness had a particular quality that neither of them had named or would name tonight, not yet. "Thank you," he said. "It's practical," she said, and meant it, and also knew that practical was not the only word that applied. She gathered the extra cloth strips. He sat back down at the papers. She started the evening bread, and the kitchen smelled like warmth and yeast and wood smoke, and outside the winter worked at the bones of the frontier, and inside Blackstone Ranch 2 people who had both arrived at their lives from very hard angles were slowly, carefully, without ceremony or announcement, building something that neither of them had been sure they'd ever have. The letter from Carlisle arrived on a Friday. She recognized the handwriting on the outside before she saw the return address, because she had grown up watching that handwriting fill ledger pages and sign documents and leave notes on the kitchen table. It was her father's hand, cramped, heavy on the downstrokes, slightly rightward lean. She stood at the mailbox for a moment with it in her hand. Gus was passing behind her with a fence post. "Something wrong?" he said. "No," she said. "Nothing wrong." She put the letter in her coat pocket and went back to the house. She did not open it immediately. She finished the noon meal, did the dishes, checked on the gray horse, split the kindling that had been piling up outside the east door. Then she sat at the kitchen table in the afternoon quiet and opened it, her father's handwriting in full. "Martha, have heard from a man named Carlisle who passed through Dry Creek and mentioned your name in connection with the Ashcroft Ranch. Word seems to have gotten out that the place is doing well. Your sisters and mother send their regards. We are planning to travel west in the spring. It would be proper for us to visit and see how you are settled. Your father, E. Holloway." She read it twice. Then she set it on the table and looked at it. The letter was brief and almost entirely without effect. No warmth, no acknowledgement of anything that had passed between them, no recognition that she had left home with nothing more than her mother's wool socks and a jar of preserves, and the absolute certainty that she would not be missed. Just the bald statement of an intended visit and the thin cover of propriety draped over what she immediately recognized as something else. Word seems to have gotten out that the place is doing well. That was the sentence. That was the whole letter. She was still sitting at the table when Rowan came in at 4 o'clock. He looked at her face. He looked at the letter on the table. "What is it?" She slid it across to him without speaking. He read it. His face didn't change in any dramatic way, but she watched something settle in it. A kind of resolution, the specific quality of a man who has identified a problem and is already calculating its dimensions. "He wants to see the ranch," Rowan said. "He wants to see if there's anything worth having," she said. He looked at her. "My father is not a visiting man," she said. "He doesn't travel for sentiment. He travels for advantage. Someone told him this ranch has value, and now he wants to assess how much of that value has my name attached to it." Rowan set the letter down. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. "What do you want to do?" he said. She looked at the letter. She looked at her hands on the table. She thought about the kitchen floor in Carlisle, the broken cup in 14 pieces, the platform at the train station, and her father's voice saying, "Don't embarrass the family." "I want to be ready for them," she said. "Whatever they come here expecting to find, I want it to be different." "Different how?" She looked up at him. "I want them to see what this place actually is, what it's become. I want them to see it clearly so that whatever they came here hoping to leverage, they can't." Rowan was quiet for a moment. Then, "They're going to come in and say whatever they say about you, about the way things look here. You know that. I know that. And you still want them to come." "I didn't say I wanted them to come," she said. "I said I want to be ready." He looked at her for a long time. She met it. "All right," he said. He picked up the letter, folded it, and set it at the edge of the table. "Spring's 2 months out. That's enough time." "Enough time for what?" He stood. He looked at her with the direct, undecorated steadiness that she had come to understand was his version of warmth. "To make sure everything here is exactly what it is," he said, "so there's nothing they can question." She watched him walk to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. "Martha," he said, without turning, "whatever they say when they get here, whatever words they bring with them, I need you to know that what you've built here, what we've built these past weeks, that doesn't go anywhere." She held very still. "I won't let them take that from you," he said. "Not this time." He went out. The door closed behind him. The kitchen was quiet. She sat at the table for a while in the afternoon light, with her hands flat on the wood surface and the folded letter at the table's edge. And she thought about her father riding west through the spring with a plan in his coat pocket and greed wearing the face of family. And she thought about 9 horses coming out of a collapsing barn one by one, and a calf standing on shaking legs in the east pasture, and a ledger rebuilt from chaos into clarity, and the specific quality of a man's voice in a kitchen doorway saying things he'd clearly never expected to say. She was not afraid of her father. She had learned something in the past 4 weeks that she hadn't known before. Not because anyone had told her, but because she had felt it accumulating in the ground beneath her feet, solid and cold and real, the way only frontier ground is real. She had learned that she had finally found a place where her size was not a liability, and her strength was not a source of shame, and her capability was not a thing to be apologized for, or minimized, or handed to someone else for safekeeping. She had found a place that was hers, and the man who had spent her entire childhood telling her she was too much to be wanted was riding toward it with a plan. She picked up the letter. She walked to the stove. She opened the grate and put it in, and she watched it catch and curl and go to ash. And then she closed the grate and started dinner. Spring came to Wyoming. The way it always did, not gently, not as an arrival, so much as a slow argument between the cold and something warmer, neither side willing to concede fully, the ground thawing and refreezing by turns until one morning you stepped outside and realized the mud had stopped freezing overnight. And that was that. The season had changed without announcing itself. Martha had been watching the road south for 2 weeks before the Holloways appeared on it. She hadn't told anyone she was watching. She simply found reasons to be on the south side of the property, checking the fence line that ran along the creek, moving the young cattle to the lower pasture, splitting wood near the south outbuilding. Rowan knew. She was fairly certain Gus knew. Neither of them said anything about it, which was exactly the right response. She had spent the 2 months since her father's letter doing what she'd told Rowan she intended to do, making sure everything was exactly what it was, so there was nothing anyone could question. The ledgers were clean and current. organized forward from her restructuring with entries that any literate person could audit. The house was maintained the way she maintained everything, not decoratively, but thoroughly. The east barn wall had been rebuilt stronger than the original. The gray draft horse, whom Dale had started calling Ghost because of the white patches on his hindquarters, had stopped spooking at unfamiliar movement and had become one of the more reliable working animals on the property. The ranch ran well. It ran because everyone in it worked, and because the work had a system now, and because the system had been built to make sense rather than to satisfy any one person's convenience. Rowan's knee was better. Not healed, it wouldn't heal, but better managed, wrapped on the cold mornings, rested when the work allowed for it, which wasn't often, but was more than before. She saw the wagon first as a dark shape against the pale spring sky, coming up the south road at the unhurried pace of a man who knows he's expected and intends to arrive on his own terms. She was at the creek fence with a pair of pliers and 3 feet of new wire, and she straightened up and watched. 2 horses pulling. A covered wagon. A better wagon than the one her father owned in Carlisle, which meant he'd either bought a new one or borrowed someone else's for the impression. Behind the wagon, riding separately, were her 2 brothers. Marcus, 24, who had his father's build and a fraction of his intelligence. Thomas, 21, who was the kind of young man whose personality would be decided entirely by whoever he happened to be standing next to. She counted 4 people total. Her father, her brothers, and the figure next to Elliot on the wagon bench. She needed another 30 seconds of watching to confirm it, but she'd suspected from the first letter. Her mother had not come. Delia had. She finished the fence wire she was working on, which took about 8 minutes, and then she walked back to the main yard, not hurrying. Rowan was already there. He'd seen the wagon from the upper pasture, apparently, because he was standing in the yard in his working clothes with his hat on and his expression set to the particular neutral she recognized as his version of readiness. Gus was somewhere behind him. She could hear Pete Briggs working in the south barn, the steady rhythm of the post mallet. The wagon came through the gate. Elliot Holloway looked exactly the same as she remembered him, which itself was a kind of answer to a question she hadn't quite let herself ask, whether time and distance had changed anything. He hadn't. He sat on the wagon bench with the weight of a man accustomed to taking up space. His coat open despite the spring cold because he ran warm and had always refused to acknowledge it. His face when he saw her had a sequence of expressions that moved through it too fast for most people to read. First the assessing sweep, the immediate inventory she had grown up under, the invisible calculation of what he saw against what he expected. Then something that might have been surprise, quickly managed. Then the social face he wore for transactions he intended to control. "Martha," he said, from the bench. "Father," she said. He climbed down. He was heavier than she remembered. Not dramatically, but visibly, the weight of a man who had added years to a frame that was already substantial. He looked at the yard. He looked at the barn. He looked at the house. He did all of this before he looked at Rowan. "Mr. Ashcroft," he said, extending his hand. Rowan shook it. "Mr. Holloway, you've had a long ride. 2 days from Laramie. The road north is rough. It smooths out come summer." Delia had climbed down from the wagon bench without assistance, which Martha noticed because it was the sort of thing Delia would have expected assistance with in Carlisle. She was wearing a traveling dress that was newer than anything in Martha's wardrobe, a pale green that set off the dark hair she'd always been proud of. She looked at the yard and then at Martha, and her expression was the one Martha knew best from her butt, that specific combination of evaluation and performance, the face of someone who is always aware of being watched. "Martha," she said, "you look well." "Delia," Martha looked at her sister directly, "you've grown your hair out." "Everyone's doing it." Delia looked at the house. "Is that the main house?" "It is." "It's smaller than I imagined." "It's large enough," Martha said. Marcus and Thomas had tied their horses to the rail and were standing near the wagon with the loose, slightly uncertain posture of men who hadn't been given their cues yet. Thomas gave Martha a small, uncomfortable nod. Marcus looked at his father. "Come inside," Martha said. "I'll put coffee on." In the kitchen, Elliot Holloway took the chair at the head of the table. It was Rowan's chair, the one that showed the wear of daily use, positioned at the table's end where the view of the yard was best. Martha watched her father take it the way she'd watched him take chairs her entire life. Not selecting it, exactly, just assuming that the best seat was his by right and sitting down. Rowan took the chair to the side without comment. His face showed nothing. She made the coffee. She set out the bread she'd baked that morning and the jar of preserved plum that she'd put up in November from the dried fruit she'd ordered through the Laramie store. She did not rush any of it. She moved through her kitchen the way she always moved, deliberately, without apology, doing each thing in the order it needed doing. Delia watched her from the doorway with an expression Martha couldn't immediately name. "You manage the whole house yourself?" Delia asked. "I do." "No girl to help?" "No." "That's a lot of work." "It is," Martha said. "I don't mind work." Delia came into the kitchen and sat at the table's corner. She looked around at the kitchen, the heavy stove, the scrubbed table, the shelf of organized preserves, the two clean ledgers on the side counter that Martha kept there for easy reference. She looked at all of it with the expression of someone doing math. "You've done well here," she said, and the words had a quality Martha recognized. The careful, slightly grudging accuracy of someone who has arrived expecting to feel superior and found the ground less favorable than anticipated. "Thank you," Martha said. Elliot had been talking to Rowan about cattle prices, which Martha understood was the opening movement of something else. Her father never asked directly about money, but he could spend 45 minutes building toward it through the language of general interest and casual inquiry, and cattle prices were his typical entry point. "Heard from a man named Ferris," Elliot was saying, wrapping both hands around his coffee cup, "that this part of the territory had a strong season. Said the Blackstone operation in particular had turned around considerable." "We've had a good winter," Rowan said. "Better than good," from what Ferris said. Elliot looked around the kitchen, at the ledgers on the counter, at Martha's back. Martha always was organized, I'll give her that. Martha kept her hands still. "She's more than organized," Rowan said. His voice was even, conversational. "She rebuilt the east barn wall after a collapse in January. She's been managing the stock records, the supply ordering, the food for the household. 2 weeks ago, she identified a case of foot rot in the east herd early enough that we only lost the one animal." Elliot looked at Rowan with the expression of a man who has heard something he was not expecting and is recalibrating. "Is that right?" he said. "I'm just telling you what she does," Rowan said. He picked up his coffee. He drank it. He said nothing else. Silence moved around the table. Marcus was eating bread. Thomas was looking at the window. Delia was looking at Martha's back. "I'll check on the horses," Martha said, and went out to the yard. She needed air. She knew it before she was halfway to the door, recognized the specific tightening in her chest that meant she was holding too much in a space that was getting small. The yard was cool, and the sky was the particular washed blue of Wyoming spring. Gus was near the water trough, doing something with a length of pipe, and he looked up when she came out. He looked at the house. He looked at her face. "They're in the kitchen," he said. It wasn't a question. "They're in the kitchen," she confirmed. He went back to the pipe. "Hitch took the Briggs brothers to the north fence this morning. Won't be back till late afternoon." She understood what he was telling her, that there would be witnesses here, that the yard would not be empty while the Holloways were in the house. "Thank you, Gus." "Just saying what's so," he said. She went to the barn. Ghost was in his stall, ears forward, and he turned his head toward her when she came in with the easy recognition he'd developed over the past 2 months. She stood with her hands on the stall rail and let the barn settle around her. The smell of hay and warm horse and old timber, the specific quiet of a space that contained animals at rest. She stayed for about 10 minutes. Then she went back inside. The next hour was managed territory. Elliot asked about the land, how many acres, what the grazing situation looked like, whether the water rights were clean. He asked about it in the language of casual interest, which fooled nobody at the table over the age of 30. Rowan answered each question factually, without volunteering anything extra, which was the appropriate response, and which Martha noted with something that was not quite gratitude and not quite relief, but sat between the two. Delia had moved from the table to the sitting area and was looking at the room with the attentive air of a woman cataloging an inventory. She had brought her own traveling bag inside, which Martha noticed because nobody had invited her to. and she set it near the sitting room door with the comfort of a person who expects to stay. "We thought we'd rest here a few days," Elliot said during a pause in the conversation. "Long ride. And I'd like to see the operation properly. Martha's been here." He made a vague gesture. 4 months now. I'd like to see how she's settled." Martha looked at her father from across the table. "You're welcome to stay 2 nights," she said. "We don't have extra rooms, so Delia can have mine. You and the boys can sleep in the bunkhouse. There are 2 empty bunks." Elliot's expression moved. "The bunkhouse," he said. "It's clean," she said. "The men keep it well. Or you can sleep in the wagon. That's your preference." A beat. "The bunkhouse is fine," Rowan said, looking at Elliot with the polite neutrality of a man who has determined the parameters of a situation and is quietly communicating them. Elliot looked between them. He looked at Martha. Whatever he'd been expecting from this visit, she thought, it had not been this particular arrangement of the room. His daughter at the stove in her own kitchen, her husband sitting easy in a working chair. The whole operation around them running with the low, steady confidence of a place that knew what it was. 2 nights is fine, Elliot said. What? The first difficulty came that evening. Delia had been in Martha's room since mid-afternoon, and when Martha came in to get her extra wrap before supper, Delia was sitting on the bed with the small writing case she always traveled with, sorting through letters. She looked up when Martha came in. "This room is tiny," she said. "It's sufficient," Martha said. "Is your husband's room larger?" Martha got her wrap from the hook. "I didn't come to discuss the rooms. I'm just asking." Delia watched her. "He sleeps across the hall?" "That's our arrangement." "He's kept you separate since you arrived?" Delia's voice was casual, but her eyes were doing a different calculation. 4 months? Martha turned to face her sister. "Our arrangement is our own, Delia. It's not a subject for this conversation. Father will ask. Father can ask what he likes. The answer will be the same." She looked at her sister directly. "Why did you come?" Delia looked down at her letters. "Father wanted company." "Father doesn't bring company unless the company serves a purpose." Delia was quiet for a moment. Then she looked up, and for just a second the performance dropped. Not completely, but enough to show something underneath it that was less comfortable to look at. "He thinks there's money here," she said. "He heard the ranch was doing well, and he thinks there's a way to... He wants to talk to you about the family situation back home, about helping." "Helping," Martha said. "We had a bad season. The Carlisle property lost the East Field to the blight. He had to let 2 of the hired men go." Delia folded her hands in her lap. "He wants to ask if you're in a position to..." "No," Martha said. Delia blinked. "You haven't heard what he..." "I don't need to." Martha held her wrap in both hands. "Whatever he came here to ask, the answer is no. Not because I don't care about the family's situation, but because whatever is here at Blackstone belongs to this ranch, and I will not redirect it to serve the people who sent me here because they thought they were disposing of a problem." Delia's mouth opened, then closed. "He's your father," she said. "I know who he is," Martha said. "Good night, Delia." She went out. Supper was managed. Not pleasant. Managed. Martha put food on the table, and the food was good, as it always was. And the conversation moved through the safe territories of weather and travel and the price of beef in Laramie. Elliot ate well. Thomas asked Dale a series of questions about cattle work with the genuine curiosity of a young man who hadn't spent much time on a working ranch. Marcus ate and said very little, which was his default, and which Martha had always found the least objectionable thing about him. After supper, Elliot announced he'd like to see the ledgers. The announcement landed in the kitchen with the specific weight of something that had been prepared in advance. "The ledgers are private business records," Rowan said. His voice was pleasant. His face was not. "Martha's the one managing them, I understand. I'm her father. I'd just like to see how she's been." "They're private records," Rowan said again, in the same tone, as if he hadn't heard any of the words between the first statement and the second. Elliot looked at him. He looked at Martha. She met his eyes without blinking. "I'll show you the south pasture in the morning if you like," she said. "The new fence sections are worth seeing. We rebuilt significant portions over the winter." He stared at her for a moment. She had the distinct sense that he was recalibrating again, was doing it continuously, each hour in this house adjusting his model of what he'd found, what it meant, what was available. "That'd be fine," he said. The evening broke up. Gus showed Elliot and the boys to the bunkhouse with the professional courtesy of a man who is perfectly capable of being polite while thinking whatever he likes. Delia went to Martha's room. Rowan and Martha were left in the kitchen. He cleared the plates. She washed them. They didn't talk until the kitchen was clean, and then he said quietly, "You said no." "I heard her tell you," he said. Not an accusation, not anything except the simple acknowledgement of a man who had been listening. "Yes." "Good." She dried the last plate and put it on the shelf. She turned to look at him. "He's going to try again in the morning," she said. "I know. With you probably, not with me." Rowan looked at her. "What does he want?" "Money. Or access to it. He had a bad season and he heard Blackstone was profitable and he came to see if there was anything he could leverage." She paused. "He thinks because I came from his house, some part of what I've built here is still his to reach." Rowan was quiet for a moment. "Is that how he's always been?" "Yes," she said, "with everything. With everyone. He finds the thing a person values most and he positions himself between them and it." He looked at her steadily. "What does he think you value most?" She didn't answer immediately. She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about most things. "This," she said, "the ranch, the work, being in a place where I'm—" She stopped. "Wanted," Rowan said quietly. The word sat between them. She hadn't said it, and she wouldn't have, but he'd heard it in the space where she'd stopped, and he'd said it without flinching. "Yes," she said. He nodded once. "Then he's not going to get anywhere," he said, "because I'm going to be there every time he tries, and I'm not someone he can move." She looked at him. She thought about the letter he'd read in February, what her father had written to Mrs. Falk about her. She thought about him reading those words and writing back anyway. She thought about a man who ran a ranch alone for 2 years and thought he'd lost the capacity to give a damn about anything that wasn't functional, and what it meant that he was standing in his kitchen at 9 o'clock at night telling her that nobody was going to take this from her. "Thank you," she said, for the second time since she'd come to Blackstone. Same word, different weight. He looked at her for a moment in the way he sometimes did now. Not the same steadiness as the first weeks. Something evolved from it, warmer at the edges in a way he probably wasn't fully aware of. "Go to bed," he said. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." It was longer than either of them anticipated. Elliot started on Rowan at breakfast. Not aggressively. Her father was not an aggressive man in the direct sense. He was a maneuvering man, a man who worked through implication and subtle pressure, who established premises before anyone realized premises were being established. He came to the table at 6, before the hands, while Martha was making eggs, and Rowan was drinking his first coffee, and he sat down and said almost immediately, "I've been thinking about your operation here." "Have you?" Rowan said. "You've done well with limited labor. 6 hands is thin for an operation this size." "We manage. I've got 2 boys with me. Marcus worked livestock in Carlisle 2 seasons back. Thomas is strong, willing." Rowan looked at him. "I'm not looking for hands. They'd work cheap, family rates." "I have a full crew," Rowan said. Martha brought the eggs to the table and sat down. She looked at her father and said nothing. Elliot switched direction. "I was hoping to speak to you both about the family's situation in Carlisle." He made his voice careful, reasonable. "We've had a difficult season. I don't like asking, but Martha's our daughter, and family looks out for each other in hard times." "Father," Martha said. He looked at her. "I told Delia last night. The answer is no." She held his gaze. "This ranch has had a difficult year in its own right. We rebuilt the east barn wall from a collapse. We managed a herd through a severe winter. Whatever we've built here has been built through the work of everyone on this property, and it's not available to redirect." Elliot's face changed. The social face, the reasonable, father of the family face, thinned out, and what was underneath it was the one she'd grown up with, the one that had looked at her across kitchen tables and wagon benches and told her without saying it directly that she was a problem to be managed. "You'd leave your own family struggling," he said. "You're not struggling," she said. "You've had a bad season. That's different. And you came here not to ask for help but to see what you could get, which is also different." She kept her voice even. "I know the difference." He looked at Rowan. It was the look of a man appealing a decision to a higher authority. Rowan was drinking his coffee. He set the cup down. Martha manages the household accounts, he said. That's her domain. I don't override her on it. Elliot's jaw tightened. You're telling me my own daughter? I'm telling you that in this house, Martha's decisions about the household stand. That's how it works here. Rowan's voice was entirely pleasant. If you have a concern about the operation, you can raise it with me directly. But the household accounts aren't the operation. Martha watched her father process this. She watched the calculation moving behind his eyes, the assessment of where the leverage was, whether there was another angle, whether the conversation could be redirected. She had seen him do this her entire life, always from the position of someone who had no power to stop it. She watched it now from a different position, and the difference was so enormous that it required a moment to fully inhabit. I see, Elliot said. He picked up his fork. I see how it is. He ate his eggs. He said nothing more about money that morning. The afternoon was when it broke open. Martha had been expecting it, in the way you expect weather you can smell coming. The morning had been too quiet after breakfast. Elliot had gone out to look at the south pasture as promised, had walked the fence with Rowan and asked questions in the register of general interest, had been perfectly civil, too civil. She knew the shape of him well enough to know that civility in her father, after a refusal, was preparatory. She was in the yard cleaning harness leather near the south barn when the Holloways gathered. She heard her father before she saw him, that particular weight in the footstep. Then Marcus. Then Thomas. Then Delia, coming from the house. And behind them all, Rowan, who had seen them converging from the upper pasture and had come down. The entire ranch, she realized in the half-second before it began, was about to witness whatever her father had decided to do. Gus was near the trough. Dale was at the fence rail. Hitch and the Briggs brothers had come back an hour ago and were near the bunkhouse, not doing anything in particular, which was itself a kind of doing something. Elliot stopped in the center of the yard. I think we ought to speak plainly, he said. His voice was loud enough to carry, loud enough to be heard by everyone in the yard. Martha understood immediately that this was intentional. She set the harness leather down and stood up. She crossed her arms and looked at her father. Speak plainly then, she said. I'm going to say what I should have said inside. He looked around the yard, at the hands, at the barn, at the house. You've done well here, I'll give you that. But I want to be clear that the arrangement you're in, he paused, is one that raised eyebrows back home. A man taking on a woman like you, Martha, with no better options. There are people in Carlisle who said he must be in a poor way to agree to what he agreed to. She felt the words land the way she'd felt the kicked hoof land in January. The impact first, the pain a second behind it. A woman like you, she said. You know what I mean. Say it plainly, she said. You told me to say it plainly. Say it. His jaw moved. A woman your size, Martha. A woman who nobody else would have. I'm not being cruel. I'm being honest. When people heard he'd sent for you, they laughed. They said it was a joke or he was desperate. The yard was perfectly silent. And yet here I am, she said. Her voice was entirely steady. Something inside her was not, but her voice was, and that was what mattered right now. Here I am in my own yard, on my own ranch, in a house that runs because of my work. Here I am, not a joke, and not a joke's end result. I'm not saying I know what you're saying. She took 2 steps toward him. Not aggressive, just closing the distance so she could look at him directly without raising her voice. I know every version of what you're saying because I've heard it my entire life. In your house, from your mouth. I skipped meals so my sisters could eat, and you called me a burden. I rebuilt the east fence in 6-degree cold and you said nothing. I kept your accounts accurate from the time I was 16, and the one time you mentioned it, it was to tell someone else I was useful for paperwork. That was the word. Useful. Her father's face had the expression she'd seen once or twice in her childhood. The expression of a man who has miscalculated where the ground is and has discovered the error mid-step. You don't understand what I understand everything you've done, she said. Every deliberate thing. You sent me here because you thought you were getting rid of a problem. You wrote to Mrs. Falk and described me in language I don't need to repeat because I know what you wrote and so does my husband. Her voice caught slightly on the last word. Not from emotion, from the specific weight of the word in this context, the rightness of it. You came here because you heard the ranch was profitable, and you wanted to find out how much of that profit you could access. And when I said no, you thought if you came out here in front of everyone and said the things you've been saying since I was 15, that I'd back down." She looked at him. She didn't blink. "I don't back down anymore," she said. "I haven't for a while. I just didn't have anywhere to stand before." Elliot stared at her. His mouth was slightly open. Behind him, Marcus had the expression of a man watching a structure he expected to be solid demonstrate unexpected instability. Thomas was looking at the ground. Delia was very still. Rowan stepped forward. He came to a stand beside Martha, not in front of her, not between her and her father. Beside her. She felt him there the way you feel solid ground after uncertain footing. He looked at Elliot Holloway, and when he spoke, his voice was the voice she'd heard him use in the coldest moments of the winter, the voice that had no temperature in it at all, which was more final than anger. "Mr. Holloway," he said, "this woman saved 9 horses from a burning barn in January. She rebuilt the east wall. She reorganized accounts that 2 professional men had failed to manage correctly. She identified a foot rot case that would have cost me half the east herd if she'd missed it. She has worked this ranch harder and smarter and with more genuine care than anyone I have ever hired or partnered with." He paused. In the yard, nobody moved. "And she did all of that," he said, "while carrying whatever your voice sounds like in the back of her head. I don't know how she managed it. I know I wouldn't have." Elliot opened his mouth. "I'm not finished," Rowan said. Still no temperature in it. "She's my wife. This is her ranch as much as mine. Anyone who insults her in this yard is going to leave this yard. I won't make exceptions for blood relation." The silence stretched. Then Elliot looked at Martha, and for the first time in her memory, he looked at her. Not at a problem, not at an inconvenience, not at a liability to be managed. He looked at her the way you look at something when you finally see what it actually is, and the scene is not comfortable. He didn't apologize. She hadn't expected him to. Her father had too much invested in never apologizing, had built his entire interior architecture around the idea that he didn't make errors, only met with circumstances. She didn't need the apology. She was not sure she would have known what to do with it. "I think," he said carefully, "we'll head on tomorrow, earlier than planned." "That's fine," Martha said. He turned and walked back toward the bunkhouse. Marcus followed. Thomas hesitated for a moment and then said, so quietly that only Martha and Rowan could hear it, "I'm sorry, Martha," for what he said. She looked at her youngest brother, who was 21 and didn't yet have a finished face, and he looked genuinely uncomfortable in the way of a young person who has just watched someone behave badly and is deciding what that means about the world. "Thank you, Thomas," she said. He went. Delia was last. She stood near the barn wall for a moment, and then she walked to Martha, and she stopped, and she said, "You look different than I remember." "I am different," Martha said. Delia nodded slowly, something moving through her face that she didn't put words to. Then she went inside. Martha stood in the yard. The hands had dispersed back to their work with the tactful speed of people who understood they had witnessed something private, even though it had happened in front of all of them. Gus was at the trough again. Dale had gone to the horse rail. Even Hitch, she noticed, had found something to do at the far end of the yard. Rowan was still beside her. She was shaking, she realized. Not visibly, not in any way that showed, but inside, in the specific way of a person who has held a great deal of tension in their body for a long time and has only just been able to release it. She had been carrying that conversation her whole life. She had been carrying the possibility of it, the dread of it, the preparation for it, for 4 months. And now it was done, and the yard was ordinary again, and the spring air smelled like mud and new grass and the distant horses. "You didn't have to say what you said," she told Rowan. "I had it. I know you had it," he said. "I wanted to say it anyway." She turned to look at him. The afternoon light was behind him, and his face was in shadow, but she knew the expression, the one she'd been learning to read for 4 months, the one that was more than it showed. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. A long, quiet, deliberate moment. "Because it's true," he said, "and because I should have been saying it a lot longer." She held his gaze. The shaking inside her was settling now, becoming something else, something that was warmer and less certain and considerably more frightening than anything her father had ever made her feel. "Go check on the cattle," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went. She stood alone in the center of the yard for a while, with the spring sun on her face and the sound of Blackstone Ranch working steadily around her on all sides. And she let herself feel all of it, everything she'd kept in the holding space, every part of the morning and the years before it. And she didn't put any of it away. She just stood there and felt it, in her own yard, on her own ground, and let it be what it was. The Holloways left the next morning before 7. Martha was up before them, as she was up before everyone, and she had coffee ready and bread sliced and a cloth bundle of dried meat and biscuits packed for the road without being asked and without making anything of it. She set it on the porch rail. When Elliot came across the yard from the bunkhouse with his coat half buttoned and his face carrying the specific expression of a man who had not slept easily, he saw the bundle and stopped. He looked at it. He looked at the house. He looked at Martha, standing in the doorway with her coffee. He picked up the bundle. "Thank you," he said. 2 words stripped of anything extra, the bare bones of courtesy with no flesh on them. But he said them. "Safe roads," she said. Marcus loaded the wagon without speaking. Thomas came to the porch and shook Martha's hand, which she hadn't expected, and held it for a moment longer than a handshake required. Delia was last. She came out of the house with her traveling bag and stopped at the porch steps. "I didn't know," Delia said. She wasn't looking at Martha when she said it. She was looking at the yard, at the barn, at the organized working reality of Blackstone in the early morning. "I didn't know it would be like this." "Like what?" Martha asked. Delia finally looked at her. "Like yours," she said. "It looks like yours." Martha held her coffee in both hands and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that would improve on what Delia had already said. Delia went down the steps and got into the wagon. Rowan came out of the house behind Martha and stood on the porch. They watched the wagon move through the gate and down the south road. Neither of them spoke until it was out of sight, and then for a little while after. "How are you?" "How are you?" Rowan said. She considered the question honestly, the way she tried to consider most things. She felt the specific emptiness that follows something long anticipated. Not grief exactly, not relief exactly, but the hollow that forms when a weight you've been bracing against is finally removed and your body hasn't adjusted yet to not bracing. "I'm all right," she said. "I'll be better by noon." He nodded. He went back inside. She heard him pour himself a second coffee. She stood on the porch a while longer, looking at the empty south road, and then she went in and started the day. The weeks after the Holloways' visit had a quality she hadn't expected. Not quieter exactly, but differently weighted. Something had settled, the way ground settles after a hard freeze thaws out. The surface irregular but more honest than it was before. She moved through the ranch work with the same efficiency as always, but there was less of the interior bracing she'd been carrying without fully acknowledging, and the difference was considerable. The hands had been different too since the yard confrontation, though none of them said anything about it directly because they were working men, and working men on a functional ranch generally didn't discuss the personal lives of the people they worked for. But there were small adjustments. The way Dale addressed her had shifted by a degree or two, carrying something new in it. The Briggs brothers, who had never been hostile but had maintained a certain professional distance, began stopping at the house porch occasionally in the evenings, talking through the next day's work with her in addition to Rowan. Even Hitch, who had made his final accounting of her during the barn fire and had been functionally respectful since, had added something warmer to his manner that she couldn't have named precisely but recognized as genuine. Gus simply continued being Gus, which was its own form of statement. The spring calving season hit in late April with the same disregard for personal circumstances that all frontier seasons demonstrated, and for 3 weeks the ranch ran on short sleep and long hours and the particular focused intensity of people managing something that demanded constant attention. She worked the calving alongside the hands, pulling difficult births in the middle of the night, monitoring the new mothers, managing the ones that rejected their calves with the patient, unhurried persistence she brought to all animal problems. It was during calving that she first noticed Rowan watching her. Not the steady, assessing regard of the early weeks. She'd grown accustomed to that, understood it as his mode of paying attention to things he was trying to understand. This was different. She caught it 3 times in 1 week. Once when she was working a difficult birth in the east pasture and looked up between contractions to find him standing at the fence, watching her with an expression she didn't have a word for. Once in the kitchen, when she was doing the evening accounting and felt his eyes on her back long enough that she turned around, and he looked away a half-second too slow. Once at supper, when she was talking to Dale about the feed rotation and heard a pause in Rowan's side of the table that had a different quality than his usual pauses. She filed it. She had learned early that Rowan Ashcroft arrived at things at his own pace and in his own order, and that pushing him toward conclusions before he'd worked through them himself produced nothing useful. She filed it, and she kept working, and she let him have his time. What she hadn't anticipated was the letter from the Laramie Land Office. It arrived on a Thursday in late May, addressed to Rowan, and she put it on the table with the rest of the post as she always did. She sorted the mail when it came from town, organized it by type, left his personal correspondence sealed and separate. But this envelope had the land office stamp, and something about it snagged at her. She set it down and left it alone. He read it that evening after supper. She was doing the accounts at the kitchen table's far end when he came in and picked it up and opened it, and she kept her eyes on the ledger and gave him his privacy. After a moment he said, "Martha." She looked up. His face had the expression she associated with problems he was calculating the dimensions of. He held the letter out. She took it and read it. The summary of it, stripped of the land office's careful language, was this. A man named Connell Wade had filed a competing claim on the water rights to the North Creek that ran through the upper pasture at Blackstone. Wade's claim cited a survey error in the original 1873 Ashcroft deed, arguing that the creek's north tributary, the one that fed the primary cattle watering point in summer, had been misdescribed in the original filing, and that under correct survey the tributary fell outside the Ashcroft claim boundary. If the claim was sustained, Blackstone would lose summer water access to the north pasture entirely. She read it twice. She set it on the table. "Who is Connell Wade?" she said. "He owns the Meridian operation, 15 miles north." Rowan sat down across from her. "We've never had a dispute. He's been expanding south for 2 years. I thought he was just buying up the small claims." "But the North Creek is the leverage point." "In summer, yes. We can manage on the South Spring for the house herd and the near pasture. But the North herd, 80 cattle, they need the creek." He rubbed the side of his face. "Without it, we'd have to move them south in July. The South pasture can't support both herds. We'd have to sell down to half before the fall market." She thought about the numbers. She'd spent enough time in the ledgers to know what half the North herd at a premature summer sale would cost them. Not catastrophic, but significant. Enough to erase most of the gains from the past 6 months and put the winter rebuild back in question. "The survey error," she said. "Is it real?" "I don't know. I don't have the original survey documents here. They'd be at the land office or with the lawyer in Laramie who handled the original deed." "Who was the lawyer?" "Man named Prescott. He retired. I don't know who has his files." She looked at the letter. She looked at the date the claim had been filed, 3 weeks ago. The land office had apparently taken 3 weeks to notify Rowan, which was its own kind of information. "We have 30 days from the filing to contest," she said. "That was 3 weeks ago." "I know." "So we have about 10 days." "I know, Martha." She looked at him. His face was tight in a way she hadn't seen since the worst of the winter. The specific tightness of a man confronting a problem that has multiple moving parts and a hard deadline. "I'll go to Laramie," she said. He looked at her. "You're needed here for the calving finish. We've still got 6 cows to drop. I can go to Laramie, find Prescott's files, and look at the original survey." She said it as a practical assessment of resources, which it was. "If the survey error is real, we need to know before we contest. If it's manufactured, we need the original documents to prove it." "It's a 2-day ride." "I know." "You'd go alone?" She looked at him. The question had 2 things in it, and she answered both of them. "I can handle 2 days on the road alone, and I can handle a land office and a filing clerk alone, if that's what you're asking." He looked at her for a moment. "I wasn't questioning your capability," he said. "I was—" He stopped. Started again. "I don't like the idea of you on the road alone for 2 days." She registered this with the careful attention she gave most things Rowan said that were more than they appeared to be. She didn't pull at the thread, but she held it. "Dale could come," she said. "He's not needed for the remaining cows, and he knows the Laramie Road." Rowan looked at the table. "All right," he said. "You and Dale. Leave Friday morning. You'll be in Laramie by Saturday noon." She picked up the letter. "What was the lawyer's full name?" Samuel Prescott. He had an office on the main street, east side. I don't know who took over his practice. I'll find it, she said. He looked at her with the expression she'd been seeing at the fence and the kitchen and the supper table, and now that it was close enough to examine, she found she still couldn't name it exactly. It was made of several things at once, and they didn't have a simple word between them. I know you will, he said. The Laramie Road in late May was better than it had been in February, but not by a margin she'd call comfortable. The mud had dried in the center, but the edges were soft, and Dale kept them to the road's crown, which required more attention than it should have, and made the 2 days longer than the distance required. Dale was good company the way young men who haven't developed the need to fill silence are good company, present and capable, and not particularly demanding. They talked about the calving, about the North Herd, about a horse Dale was thinking about buying from a man in the Southern Valley. Easy conversation that required nothing. She spent most of the time thinking about the water claim. The more she thought about it, the more she found the timing interesting. 3 weeks after the Holloways' visit, which was too long to be connected, she was fairly sure, and too coincidental to dismiss entirely. Connell Wade had been expanding south for 2 years, Rowan had said. That was patient behavior. Patient behavior suggested someone who had been watching and waiting for the right moment. The right moment for a water rights challenge was after a difficult season when a ranch was financially strained and less able to sustain a legal contest. The previous winter had been hard. Anyone in the territory who paid attention would have known that. She filed that thought and kept it. In Laramie, she found the land office first. The filing clerk was a young man with the exhausted efficiency of someone managing more work than was reasonable, and when she explained what she needed, the original Ashcroft deed from 1873 and any associated survey documents, he looked at her with the expression of a man being asked to do something that would take longer than he wanted it to. That's 50 years of files, he said. 1873 is a specific year, she said, and Ashcroft is a specific name. Is there an index? There was an index. It took 40 minutes and considerable negotiation of the index's internal logic, but there was one, and she found the entry, and the filing clerk retrieved the documents with the put-upon air of a man being asked to do his job. She sat at a table in the back of the land office and read the original Ashcroft deed of 1873 and the survey that accompanied it and the water rights attachment that had been filed separately in 1875. She read them twice. Then she asked for paper and a pen and copied 3 specific passages from the water rights attachment word for word. The creek's north tributary was described in the 1875 attachment as running from the northern boundary marker at the stone cairn to the junction with the main creek body, said tributary being entirely within the claim boundary as described in the original 1873 deed. She copied that. She also copied the boundary description from the original 1873 deed, which described the northern boundary marker in terms that included a specific landmark, a double-trunk cottonwood at the ridgeline, that was either still standing or wasn't, and which would be either consistent or inconsistent with Connell Wade's survey claim. She needed to find Prescott's files. The lawyer who had taken over Prescott's practice was a man named Hugh Alderman, operating from a narrow office on the east side of the main street, exactly where Rowan had said. He was older than she expected, mid-50s, with the careful, unhurried manner of a lawyer who had been practicing long enough to not be surprised by much. She explained what she needed. He looked at her with the professional assessment of a man deciding how much time this was worth. "You're Mrs. Ashcroft," he said. "Yes." "Rowan Ashcroft's wife." "Yes." He didn't come himself. "He's managing a calving season," she said. "I'm here instead. Is that a problem?" Alderman looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "It's not a problem." He stood. "The Prescott files are in the back. Give me 20 minutes." It took 30. He came back with a manila folder that held a collection of documents going back to the original deed transaction, including correspondence between Prescott and the land office, a rough map of the property boundary as Prescott had understood it, and a letter from 1876 in which Prescott had specifically noted that the Northern Water Rights Attachment had been filed in response to an earlier inquiry from a neighboring claim. The inquiry, she noticed, had come from an operation that no longer existed, having been sold twice since and currently forming the southern portion of what was now the Meridian operation. She looked at that letter for a long time. "Mr. Alderman," she said, He was sitting across the table reading his own copy of something. This letter from 1876, the inquiry about the Northern water rights. It came from the claim that's now part of Meridian. He looked at the letter. He looked at her. So the current owner of Meridian, she said, is challenging water rights that his own land's predecessor specifically acknowledged as belonging to Blackstone 50 years ago. Alderman was quiet for a moment. He read the letter again. He read it carefully, the way lawyers read things when they're deciding what the words actually mean. That's not dispositive, he said. A challenge can be filed regardless of prior correspondence. I know, but it's relevant. It's relevant, he agreed. It would need to be filed alongside a formal counter-survey. He looked at her. Do you have access to the original boundary markers? The landmarks described in the 1873 deed? The northern boundary marker is described as a double-trunk cottonwood at the ridge line. I'd need to verify whether it's still standing. If it is, and if a licensed surveyor can confirm the boundary as described in the original deed, that would substantially weaken Wade's claim. Alderman set the letter down. Wade's survey presumably argues that the boundary runs east of the cottonwood. Your argument would be that it runs west. Yes. The cottonwood is either east or west of the creek's north tributary. Yes. He looked at her steadily. Mrs. Ashcroft, have you done this kind of work before? I've kept legal records, she said, and I understand property documents. I haven't done this specific thing before. You're doing it adequately, he said, with the dry precision of a man who gave compliments in the same register he gave everything else. Can you represent us in the contest? She said. I can. My fee is $8 for the filing and preparation, plus costs if it goes to a formal hearing. She thought about the ledger numbers. $8 was manageable. A formal hearing would be more, but they'd cross that when they reached it. All right, she said. I'll need copies of these 3 documents. She indicated the ones she'd identified. And I'll need you to prepare the contest filing by next Thursday. That gives us 2 days inside the deadline. Alderman looked at her. Next Thursday, she said. Yes, ma'am, he said. She and Dale started back the next morning. The road home was faster than the road out, partly because the ground had dried another half day, and partly because she was moving with the specific purposeful energy of a person who has found the thread of a problem and is following it. She told Dale what she'd found at the lawyer's office. Not all of it, but the relevant shape of it, that the water claim was challengeable, that there was documentation, that she'd engaged a lawyer to file the contest. He listened with the focused attention he gave to things that mattered to the ranch, asking 2 practical questions and no unnecessary ones. Will Wade know we filed? He asked. His lawyer will be notified when we do. What does he do then? His options narrow. He can push forward to a formal hearing, which costs him money and time, and which he now knows he'll lose if we have the boundary survey confirmed. Or he can withdraw the claim. Dale thought about this. What kind of man is Wade? I don't know him, she said. I know he's been patient. Patient men calculate before they act. Once the calculation changes, they adjust. So he'll back down? I think so. But I want the boundary survey done regardless, so the claim is on record properly. Dale was quiet for a while. The road wound through a long meadow with the mountains visible to the west, still carrying snow on the upper elevations. A hawk circled somewhere far up in the blue. Can I say something? Dale said. Go ahead. He took a moment to organize it. When you came here in January, I wasn't sure. He was looking at the road. I didn't say anything. I just wasn't sure about how it would go. I know, she said. And then the barn. He paused. I've been on 2 other ranches before this one. I've never seen anyone do what you did in that barn. She looked at the road ahead. Gus says you were the one that held this place together this winter, Dale said. He doesn't say much, so when he says something, Gus has his own way of saying things, she said. I know, He stopped, tried again. I'm glad you stayed. That's all I'm trying to say. I'm glad you didn't leave. She thought about the train platform in Laramie 5 months ago, the bay horse and the working wagon and the man with the scar on his jaw who had looked at her directly across 30 feet of platform without flinching. I was never going to leave, she said. This is mine. Dale nodded once, with the satisfied simplicity of a young man who has said what he meant and received what he needed back. They rode the rest of the way in easy silence. She got back to Blackstone in the late afternoon of the second day to find Rowan in the south barn with his sleeves rolled to the elbow, working the last of the difficult calves with Gus. She put her horse up, confirmed with Ernesto that the north herd was fine, washed her hands and face at the pump, and went to the barn. He looked up when she came in. "Well?" he said. "The claim is contestable," she said. "I've engaged Alderman in Laramie. He took over Prescott's practice. He'll file the contest by Thursday." She came into the barn and leaned against the stall rail. There's a 1876 letter in Prescott's files from the predecessor claim to Meridian, specifically acknowledging Blackstone's North Water rights. Wade's own land's history undercuts his claim. Rowan looked at her with the full attention she'd learned to read as his version of open surprise. "And we need a surveyor to confirm the northern boundary marker," she said. "The double-trunk cottonwood at the ridge. Is it still standing?" "It's standing," he said. "I've ridden past it 100 times." "Then we're in a strong position." She looked at the calf he'd been working, which was on its feet and functional, if unsteady. "How did the last ones go?" He looked at the calf. He looked at her. "Fine," he said. "All 6. No losses." "Good." A pause. He was still looking at her with that expression. She waited. "You did all that in 2 days," he said. "It needed doing in 2 days. You went to the land office and found the original survey and located Prescott's successor and identified relevant documentation and engaged a lawyer." He said it as a list, not as flattery, just as a man reading back the contents of something to make sure he'd understood correctly. "Yes?" she said. He looked down at his hands for a moment. He'd been using them hard, and they showed it, rough at the knuckles, oil and straw ground into the creases. He turned them over once and looked at them, and then looked back up at her. "I need to tell you something," he said. Gus, with the instinctive social accuracy of a man who had been around long enough to recognize when to disappear, suddenly found an urgent reason to be at the other end of the barn. Rowan came out of the stall and let the gate close behind him. He stood in the barn's central aisle, close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes, the particular weariness in his face that was not defeat, but was the residue of years of carrying things. "When my wife died," he said, I told myself there were things I'd had once that I wouldn't have again. Wasn't self-pity. Just what seemed like an honest accounting." He stopped. He pressed his lips together briefly. "I thought the most I could hope for was something functional, a working arrangement, 2 people being useful to each other and not making the other's life worse." She held herself still. "Then you came," he said, "and you were more than useful, right from the first morning, not just the work, the way you—" He paused, and she could see him working through something, choosing between several things he might say. "You were capable, yes, but you also cared. About the animals, about the ledgers, about whether the food was good, and whether the hands were working well, and whether the east barn wall was properly rebuilt. You cared about everything, as if it was worth caring about." He looked at her. "And I couldn't figure out why, after everything you'd been through, you still cared like that." She didn't look away. "Because caring about things is what I have," she said. "It's what nobody could take, no matter what else they took." He was quiet for a moment. "Your father stood in that yard and said what he said," he said, "and you didn't break." "No. You haven't broken once since you got here. Through the winter, the barn, the calving, your family, you don't break." "I break," she said, "just not where anyone can see." He looked at her with something that was past the unnamed expression she'd been watching for weeks. This was further along, more arrived at, as if he'd finished a calculation he'd been running for a long time and arrived at the sum and was now holding it. "I don't want a functional arrangement anymore," he said. "I want to tell you that. I know I can't expect that to change anything. I know what we agreed to in January. I'm not asking you to change anything." He stopped. His jaw moved. "I just need you to know that what I feel about this, about you, it's not functional. It hasn't been functional for a while." The barn was very quiet. The calf breathed softly in the stall behind him. Somewhere at the far end, Gus was working at something with focused deliberateness. She looked at Rowan Ashcroft. The scar along his jaw, the roughed hands, the face that had been worked on by weather and hard seasons and grief and solitude, and which was now looking at her with the unguarded directness of someone who has taken a risk they've been preparing for longer than they've admitted. "I know," she said. He blinked. "I've known for a while," she said. "I've been watching you try to figure out what to do about it." He made a sound that might have been a short laugh if he'd been more comfortable with laughing. "How long?" "Since the calving started, maybe before." "Why didn't you—" "Because you needed to get there yourself," she said. "You're not a man who arrives quickly at things. That's not a criticism." He looked at her steadily. "What are you saying, Martha?" She took a breath. She thought about the kitchen floor in Carlisle and the train platform and the first morning with biscuits and coffee and the gray horse and 9 animals coming through a burning barn door and a letter that had gone to ash in a stove grate in a land office in Laramie and every accumulation of days that had brought her to standing in a barn in Wyoming in the late afternoon of a May day with mud on her boots and a man who saw her. "I'm saying that I started with a functional arrangement," she said, "and I don't want that either. Not anymore." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with any performance, just picked it up and held it the way you hold something you're not willing to put down again. His hand was warm and rough and very solid. She held it back. "All right," he said quietly. "All right," she said. It was not a declaration. It was not the language of novels or songs. It was two people who had both been through enough to know the value of a plain, true thing said plainly. And it was enough, more than enough, given what either of them had expected from the world. The water rights contest was filed on Wednesday, one day inside the deadline. Alderman sent a copy to Blackstone and to Wade's registered attorney in Laramie. The boundary survey was arranged for the following week. A licensed surveyor named Frank Aller, who came out from Laramie with his equipment and spent half a day on the North Ridge confirming what the 1873 deed described. The double-trunk cottonwood was exactly where the original survey had placed it, putting the north tributary well inside the Blackstone boundary. Oller's report, combined with Alderman's contest filing and the 1876 Prescott correspondence, was submitted to the land office on a Friday. Connell Wade withdrew his claim 11 days later. There was no letter, no explanation, no contact. The land office simply notified Alderman that the filing had been withdrawn, and Alderman sent word to Blackstone. And that was the end of it. Martha was at the kitchen table doing the summer supply order when Rowan came in with Alderman's letter. He read it. He set it on the table in front of her. She read it. She set it down. "Good," she said, and went back to the supply order. Rowan sat down across from her. He was fighting the corner of his mouth. "That's all?" he said. "What else would I say?" "You went to Laramie and dug through 50 years of files and found the document that won this in 2 days. I did what needed doing." "Martha." She looked up. "You saved the North Herd," he said. "I want to say that clearly." She looked at him. "The North Herd was ours to save," she said. "That's the difference between this and every place I've been before. Here, when I save something, it stays saved. For us." He held her gaze. "For us," he agreed. She went back to the supply order. He stayed at the table. After a while, he got up and poured 2 cups of coffee and brought one back and set it by her elbow without saying anything, and she picked it up and drank it without saying anything, and they sat together in the kitchen doing the quiet work of a life that was, against considerable odds, turning out to be something worth having. It was a Saturday evening in late June when Rowan came to find her at the south fence. She'd been checking the gate hardware, which had been sticking since the ground shifted in the spring, and she had her tools in her coat pocket and her sleeves rolled up despite the cooling evening, because she'd intended to do a quick check and had instead found 3 additional things that needed attention and had lost track of the time. She heard his boots on the path and knew it was him by the gate. The slight unevenness in the right leg, still there but managed. The careful weight distribution she'd watched improve over months of wrapped mornings. He came to the fence and stood beside her. "Supper's getting cold," he said. 2 more minutes. He leaned on the fence rail and looked out at the south pasture in the evening light. The cattle were spread across it in the loose, settled arrangement of animals at the end of a good day. The light was long and golden, and the mountains to the west had their last snow thinning to almost nothing at the peaks. "I've been thinking about something," he said. She finished the hardware check. "What?" He was quiet for a moment. The quiet had a weight to it. Not the calculated quiet of someone organizing words. but the particular quiet of someone close to something they've been working toward for a while. When I came back from the war, he said, the first thing I noticed about Wyoming was how much sky there was. Where I'd been, in the south, everything was close. Trees, buildings, smoke. You couldn't see the distance. You couldn't see where things were going. He paused. The first morning I rode onto this land before I bought it, the agent was talking numbers behind me and I wasn't listening. I was looking at how far you could see. I thought, if I could live somewhere I can see that far, I can handle whatever comes in between. She looked at him. He pushed off the fence rail and turned to face her. The evening light was behind her and his face was clear and unguarded in a way that still sometimes stopped her. This man who had spent years maintaining surfaces, opening gradually, without ceremony, without show. I want you to ride up to the North Ridge with me tomorrow morning, he said. Before the day starts, I want to show you something. What is it? I want to show you what it looks like from up there. He looked at her directly. I want to see it with you. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about January, said, the platform, the wagon, the first coffee, the broken ledger, the calf in the freezing mud. She thought about everything it had taken to get from that first morning to this fence on a June evening with the cattle settling in the south pasture, and a man who had never expected to say the things he'd been saying looking at her like she was something solid in uncertain country. All right, she said, before the day starts. He nodded. He held out his hand. She took it. They walked back to the house together in the long summer evening, and the supper was cold, and neither of them minded in the least. They rode up to the North Ridge the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the mountains. Rowan had saddled both horses in the dark without waking anyone, which she knew because she heard him in the barn at 4:30 and lay in bed for a few minutes, listening to the familiar sounds of it. The creak of the stall gate, the soft movement of the animals, the particular quiet competence of a man doing something he'd done 10,000 times. She got up and dressed and came out to find both horses ready and Rowan standing with the reins and 2 cups of coffee he'd somehow managed to bring from the house without spilling. She took hers. They didn't talk. They rode out of the yard in the pre-dawn gray, heading north along the creek line and then up the long slope toward the ridge, the horses moving easily in the cool air, their breath visible in small clouds. The ridge took about 40 minutes to reach at an easy pace. The sky was doing the thing it did in Wyoming at that hour. Not yet fully light, but somewhere past dark, the quality of it changing by the minute in a way that was impossible to capture and impossible to look away from. She'd grown up in flat country where the horizon was always near. The distance you could see from this ridge was something she still hadn't entirely absorbed, even after 6 months. Rowan stopped his horse at the ridge crest and she stopped beside him. Below them, spreading south and east and west, was Blackstone. All of it, the house, the barns, the south pasture where the cattle were still shapes in the half-dark, the creek line threading silver through the lower ground, the fence lines visible as thin dark threads across the grassland. To the north, the land continued rolling away toward the mountains, the upper pasture where the north herd had been wintering, the cottonwood that had just saved them marked by its double trunk against the sky. She sat on her horse and looked at it. There it is, Rowan said. He wasn't being poetic about it. He was just saying what was true. Here it is, the whole of it, seen at once. I've never seen it from here, she said. I come up maybe 3 or 4 times a year when I need to remember what I'm doing it for. He held his coffee in both hands. The steam rose in the cold air. My wife never came up here. She didn't like the horses much, and the rides long enough. He said it without pain, she noticed, not without memory, but without the particular tightness she'd heard in his voice in the early months when her name came up. Something had loosened around the grief over time. Not dissolved, she didn't think grief like that dissolved, but settled into its actual proportions. Part of the landscape of him, visible, but no longer the whole view. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. When you wrote to Mrs. Falk, when you decided to go through with it, after my father's letter, she looked at the land below. What were you actually hoping for? He was quiet for a moment. The horses shifted. Honestly, he said. Please. I was hoping not to be alone anymore, he said. Not in the... I don't mean company. I had the hands for company. I mean the specific alone where you're the only one who cares whether the place survives. The only one who knows what it cost to get here and what it would cost to lose it. He looked at the land. That kind of alone gets into you after a while. It changes how you think. She understood this precisely. She had been that kind of alone her entire life. The alone of being in a house full of people, none of whom saw you. The alone of doing essential work that went unacknowledged. The alone of knowing your own worth and having no one in the world reflect it back. "Did you find it?" she said. "What you were hoping for?" He turned to look at her. The sun was breaking at the mountain edge now, the first real light coming sideways across the ridge, and it caught the scar on his jaw and the weathered lines of his face and his eyes, which were a dark, specific brown she had learned to read like a second language. "You know I did," he said. She looked back at the land. Below them, a light came on in the bunkhouse window. Dale? Probably. He was almost as early a riser as she was. The morning was beginning to happen, the slow, daily machinery of Blackstone starting up, and she felt it in her chest the way she felt it every morning, that particular warmth that she had no precise word for, but which she suspected was what belonging felt like from the inside. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I came here prepared to be useful," she said. "That was the whole of my expectation, to be useful enough that I wouldn't be sent back, to earn my place the way I'd always earned everything, by working until the work was undeniable." She paused. She was choosing words carefully, not because she was afraid of the wrong ones, but because she wanted the right ones. "I didn't come here expecting this." "This," he said. "To matter," she said, "not as a function, as a person. I didn't expect to matter to someone." The silence between them had the quality of the morning itself, wide and still and full of something. He reached across the space between the horses and put his hand over hers on the reins. Just that. His palm over her hand, warm and immediate. "You matter," he said. "You have since before I knew what to do about it." She turned her hand over under his and held on. They sat on the ridge until the sun was fully up and the land below was gold and ordinary and entirely theirs, and then they rode back down together to start the work of the day. The summer that followed was the hardest and the best season Blackstone had seen in years, which was a combination she was beginning to understand was simply the frontier's nature. It gave you things by making you earn them past what seemed reasonable, and the earning was inseparable from what you got. The North herd thrived now that the water rights were settled and the summer grazing was undisturbed. By August, the cattle were in condition she hadn't seen since she arrived, and when Rowan went over the fall sale projections with her at the kitchen table, the numbers were the best the ledger had recorded in 3 years. "We could hire another hand for winter," he said. "Gus has been talking about his back." "Gus's back has been talking for 6 months. He hasn't slowed down. He won't say anything directly. That's not his way." "I know." She looked at the numbers. "Hire someone in September. Give Gus time to ease into the lighter work without it being about his back." Rowan looked at her. "You've thought about this. Gus is the reason this ranch ran at all between your wife's death and my arrival. He held things together on loyalty alone. He deserves not to be asked to work through another hard winter at full pace." Rowan looked at the table for a moment. "I should have thought of that myself. You were managing everything else. That's not an excuse." She looked at him. "No," she agreed, "but it's a reason. There's a difference." He absorbed this. He was good, she'd found, at absorbing things he hadn't considered, better than most men, who tended to treat an unexamined oversight as either a major failure or a thing not worth examining. He just absorbed it and moved it into his accounting of the world without drama. "September," he said. "I'll ask around." The new hand came in mid-September, a man named Roy, 40-something, quiet, with the efficient, unhurried manner of someone who had been doing this work long enough that it was simply what he was. He settled into the bunkhouse without friction and took on the heavier rotation with the matter-of-fact willingness of a man who understood the job. Gus never said anything about his back again, but she noticed, on the cold mornings, that he moved with less of the braced-forward effort she'd watched all summer, and she considered that resolved. Fall came in hard and fast, the way Wyoming fall did. One week the days were long and gold, and the next the temperature was dropping overnight, and the herd needed moving to the winter pasture. She managed the transition alongside Rowan, the two of them working the cattle with a wordless coordination that she'd noticed developing over the summer without being able to pinpoint when it had started. They'd worked beside each other long enough that she knew when he was going to call for the turn before he called it. And he knew when she'd seen something in the herd that needed attention before she said it. And this knowledge lived in the body rather than the head. The accumulated fluency of two people who had paid sustained attention to each other for a long time. Hitch noticed it first, or at least was the first to say something. He caught her at the water pump one morning in October, just the two of them, and said in his flat, direct way, "You two move like you've been doing this 20 years. She considered that. "We've been doing it less than a year." "I know." He worked the pump handle. "Doesn't look like it." She thought about what it looked like from the outside and decided she didn't need to have a feeling about that. She filled her bucket and went back to the house. The letter from Thomas arrived in November, not from her father, from her youngest brother, written in his own hand, which she recognized from the careful, deliberate printing of a young man who had not written many letters and was taking it seriously. It was 4 paragraphs. The first described the situation in Carlisle, a better season than last year, the Eastfield recovering, their father's temper not improved, but his circumstances stabilized. The second asked after the ranch and the Wyoming winter, genuine curiosity with no angle behind it. The third said that he'd been thinking about what he'd seen when he visited in the spring, about the ranch and about Martha, and that he wanted her to know he thought she'd done something worth being proud of, and that he was sorry for the years he hadn't said so. The fourth paragraph was 2 sentences. "Delia says the same. She told me to tell you she means it." Martha read the letter twice at the kitchen table. She folded it and put it in the drawer where she kept the ranch documents that mattered. She didn't respond immediately. She thought about it for 3 days, and then she wrote back. 2 paragraphs, factual and direct, telling Thomas about the North herd and the water rights and the new hand and the winter preparations. In the last line she said, "Tell Delia I know she means it. She didn't write to her father. She might one day." She hadn't decided. She knew it would not repair anything that had been broken. She'd been around long enough to understand that some fractures in certain kinds of relationships don't repair. They simply stabilize, and stabilized is sometimes the best available outcome. What she knew was that she didn't carry the weight of it anymore the way she had. It had found its proportions, like Rowan's grief, and settled into the landscape of her without dominating the view. The thing about being seen, genuinely seen, by someone who chose to see you without obligation, was that it changed the interior arithmetic. The voice that had cataloged her failures and found her lacking did not disappear entirely. She didn't think it ever would. But it had lost its authority. You could hear a voice and not give it the vote. The first real test of the winter came in December, and it didn't come from the weather. A rancher from the eastern edge of the territory named Fulton came through the valley in early December, stopping at 3 or 4 properties as he went. And he stopped at Blackstone on a Tuesday afternoon while Rowan was at the north fence and Martha was in the kitchen doing the December supply order. She heard a horse in the yard and looked out and saw a man she didn't know tying up at the rail with the comfortable familiarity of someone who expected to be received. She went out. He was in his mid-50s, well-dressed for a working rancher. Not ostentatiously, but with the specific quality of a man who has money and doesn't try to hide it. He looked at her when she came out the door with the particular expression she still encountered occasionally. The brief recalibration, the reassessment of what he'd expected from the Blackstone household. She was accustomed to it. She let it move through him and settle. "Mrs. Ashcroft?" he said. "Yes." "Silas Fulton. I've got the Fulton operation about 40 miles east. I was hoping to speak with your husband." "He's at the north fence. He'll be back in about an hour." She looked at the man steadily. "I manage the ranch accounts and operations alongside him. If your business is with the ranch, I can likely help." Fulton looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating a second time in the same 30 seconds. Then something in him seemed to decide, and he nodded. "I've been hearing about Blackstone," he said, "about the turnaround this year. My operation's been having trouble with the calving rate. Lost nearly 20% of newborns last spring. I heard your ranch had a clean season." She thought about the calving weeks in April, the short sleep, the long hours, the 6 difficult births, the monitoring protocol she'd established that meant no cow in active labor was ever more than an hour from attention. "We had 1 loss," she said, "out of 43. Fulton looked at her with undisguised interest. "1 loss." "1." She considered him. What's your monitoring setup during calving season? The hands check morning and evening. That's where you're losing them, she said. Active labor happens on its own schedule. Morning and evening checks miss the hard deliveries that happen in the middle. You need someone rotating through the night during peak weeks. He looked at her. Is that what you do? It's what we all do during calving. The hands rotate. My husband and I take the late shifts. She paused. Also, your nutrition before calving matters considerably. What are you feeding the cows in the last 6 weeks before drop? He told her. She told him what she'd changed in the Blackstone herd's late pregnancy nutrition based on something she'd read in an agricultural report she'd ordered through the Laramie Library in February. He listened with the focused attention of a man who had come expecting a social call and had found something more useful. They were still talking when Rowan came back from the north fence. He came through the gate and stopped when he saw them. Took in the scene, Martha at the porch rail, and a man he didn't immediately know standing in the yard with the posture of someone engaged in a productive conversation. He came across the yard. Rowan, this is Silas Fulton, Martha said. He's been having trouble with his calving rate. We've been discussing protocol. Rowan shook Fulton's hand. He looked at Martha. The corner of his mouth moved just enough for her to catch. She's the one to talk to about calving, he said. She managed ours. Fulton stayed for another hour. She made coffee, and the three of them sat at the kitchen table and went through it in more detail. The rotation schedule, the nutrition plan, the early warning signs she monitored in the last 2 weeks before the season started. Fulton took notes in a small book he kept in his coat pocket. He left with 3 pages of specific recommendations and the expression of a man who had gotten considerably more than he'd come for. At the gate, he stopped and looked back at her. Mrs. Ashcroft, he said, would you be willing to consult if I have questions during the season? She looked at him. Send a letter, she said. I'll do what I can. He nodded and rode out. Rowan closed the gate and stood beside her. Consult, he said. He's losing 20% of his calves. That's fixable. I know it's fixable. You just told him how to fix it. She shrugged. He asked. Rowan turned to look at her with the expression that still, after all this time, had the capacity to do something to her chest. The full, uncomplicated, unguarded regard of someone who is looking at something they're genuinely grateful exists. 3 ranchers in the valley have asked me in the last 2 months who's been running the calving operation, he said. I told them you. She looked at him. What did they say? Fulton said it better than the others. He said, I'm telling you this exactly. He said, that woman knows cattle the way most men wish they did. She looked at the gate Fulton had ridden through. She thought about her father's kitchen. She thought about the platform in Laramie and the gray winter sky, and a man holding his hat in his hands. She thought about mud and cold and broken cup pieces counted on a floor and a jar of preserves on a windowsill. That's not bad, she said. No, Rowan agreed. It's not. The winter settled in for real in January. The second January she'd spent at Blackstone, and she felt the difference between this one and the last. The way you feel the difference between walking unfamiliar ground in the dark and walking ground, you know. The cold was the same, the work was the same weight, but she moved through it differently, with the specific efficiency of someone who knows where the floor is. The east barn wall held. Ghost turned 2 years old and had become, by some organic process she hadn't entirely directed, the horse she rode most consistently. He'd found a steadiness over the year that was earned rather than bred. The reliability of an animal that had been frightened and then patiently shown it didn't have to be. She thought sometimes that she understood exactly how that felt. Gus turned 58 in February. She found out from Dale, who mentioned it in passing, and she made a cake. Not a particularly good one. She wasn't a baker. She was better with bread than with anything that required precision, and put it on the bunkhouse table. Gus came in for supper and looked at it, and then looked at her with the expression he used for things he approved of, but wasn't going to make a production over. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know, she said. He ate 2 pieces and didn't say anything else about it, which was exactly right. Dale announced in March that he'd bought the horse from the man in the Southern Valley, a 3-year-old roan that he'd been talking about since the previous summer, and he brought it back to the ranch with the barely contained delight of a young man who has wanted a thing for a long time and finally has it. She looked the horse over carefully, felt its legs, checked its teeth, and told Dale it was a good purchase. His face did something that reminded her of Thomas at age 14, the expression of uncomplicated pleasure at being told a decision was sound. She thought often about what it cost people, never being told their decisions were sound. She thought about it particularly in the context of Rowan, who had made hundreds of decisions in his years running Blackstone alone, with no one to confirm or question or refine them. Who had built something real and substantial and kept it running through grief and loss and isolation, and who had never, she'd pieced this together gradually from things said and unsaid, had anyone in his life who treated the work as a shared thing rather than as his burden to carry and their benefit to receive. She thought this was not the least of what he'd needed, and she thought she had given it to him, that this was perhaps the most fundamental thing she had brought to Blackstone, not the ledgers or the calving management or the water rights defense, though all of those mattered, but the simple daily fact of someone who treated his work as worth caring about because she was part of it. Someone who sat across from him at the kitchen table and argued about the supply order and asked about the fence conditions and noticed when his knee was bad and pushed back when she thought he was wrong. The equalness of it. That was the thing. Two people in a genuine partnership, neither of them carrying the whole of it, neither of them ornamental. She had not known this was available to her. She had spent 28 years being managed and assigned and disposed of, and she had not known that this was a thing she could have, not because she hadn't wanted it, but because she hadn't been able to conceive of it clearly enough to want it specifically. Now she knew. And the knowing changed things in ways she was still finding. Check. The evening in late March when it happened was unremarkable in its circumstances, which she would think about later and find appropriate. They were in the kitchen after supper, the lamps lit against the early dark. She was reading an agricultural report she'd ordered, a long piece on winter forage management that the University of Colorado had published, which she'd sent for after Fulton's visit. Rowan was at the table with the spring supply list, which they'd go over together later. He said her name. She looked up. He was looking at his list, but not at his list. His eyes were focused at a distance that was interior rather than external, the look she recognized as the end of a long internal process. "I've been thinking," he said. "I know," she said. "You've been thinking for about 2 weeks." He looked at her. Was it that visible? Only to me. He set the supply list down. He turned in his chair to face her fully, which was how she knew it was significant. Rowan didn't orient his body toward things that weren't significant. "When I came back from the war," he said, "I thought I'd used up the part of me that could want things, not material things. The other kind. I thought that part was gone, and I'd made my peace with it." He stopped. He looked at his hands. "I was wrong. It wasn't gone. It was just waiting for something worth wanting." She set the agricultural report down. "Martha." He looked at her with the fullness she'd only seen him give to things that cost him something. "I'm not good at saying things plainly when they matter most. You know that about me." "You're better than you think," she said. "I want—" He stopped. He took a breath, which was itself unusual for him. "I want to ask you something that I know you might not, that I know the terms we started with didn't include. I want to ask if you would consider whether what we have could be." He pressed his lips together briefly and started again, more simply. "I want to ask if you would stay, not because of the ranch, not because of the arrangement, because I want you here. Because this place is yours as much as mine, and I want it to be yours completely, and I want—" He stopped again, and this time he looked at her directly, and there was nothing managed in his face, nothing held in reserve, just the plain and unguarded truth of a man who has used up every buffer he owns and is saying the real thing. "I want to spend the rest of my life being the person who sees you, if you'll let me." The kitchen lamp flickered once and steadied. She looked at him for a long time. She looked at the scar and the weathered lines and the rough hands and the dark eyes and the 50 years of difficulty and dignity that were written in the whole of him, and she thought about a girl who had counted 14 pieces of a broken cup on a kitchen floor in Carlisle and decided it was easier to count than to feel, and she thought, "Look at how far we've come from there." "Rowan," she said. "Yes." "I already stayed," she said. "I decided that a long time ago." He looked at her. "I'm asking about the rest," he said quietly. She held his gaze. "So am I," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand the way he'd taken it on the south fence last June, direct, certain, not letting go. She held it back. And outside, the Wyoming winter was doing what Wyoming winter did, working at the boards and the ground and the fence lines, testing everything against itself. And inside Blackstone Ranch, the lamp burned steadily and the stove was warm, and two people who had arrived at each other from very hard angles had, without ceremony or perfection, chosen each other completely. The spring brought Fulton's letter, as she'd expected it would. 4 specific questions about early calving indicators, written in the careful hand of a man who had taken her previous advice seriously and wanted more. She answered it at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning while Rowan was out with Gus looking at the north fence condition after the winter. She was halfway through the second question when Dale knocked on the door and said that a woman had ridden in from the Crawford place 2 valleys over, asking if Mrs. Ashcroft was available. The Crawford woman had a cow in a difficult labor, and their own hands hadn't been able to manage it, and someone in Laramie had said to ask Martha Ashcroft. Someone in Laramie had said her name. She sat with that for a moment before she got up. She went. She managed the labor, a breech presentation, not complicated if you knew what you were doing, complicated if you didn't. And the calf came, and the cow survived, and the Crawford woman, who was about 50 with the practical steadiness of someone who had been running a ranch since before Martha was born, looked at her afterward with an expression that was neither surprise nor effusive gratitude, but something more level and more useful, acknowledgement between equals. "You know what you're doing," Mrs. Crawford said. "I've had practice," Martha said. "We've been ranching this valley 15 years, and I've never seen anyone manage a breech that clean." Martha cleaned her hands in the bucket of water the hands had brought. "Your cow's strong. That helped." Mrs. Crawford looked at her. "I've heard about Blackstone, about the turnaround." She paused. "They say you're the one." Martha looked at the cow, which was nosing at the calf with the focused single-mindedness of a new mother. "We're both the one," she said. "That's how it works there." Mrs. Crawford considered this. "Not many places it works that way." "No," Martha agreed. "Not many." She rode back to Blackstone in the late afternoon light, the mountains holding their last snow, the valley floor turning the first tentative green of an arriving spring. She came through the gate and put up her horse and washed properly at the pump and went inside. Rowan was at the table with the fence report. He looked up. "Crawford place," she said. "Breech labor. Both fine." "I heard someone had ridden in," and he looked at her. "You all right?" "Perfectly." He looked at her in the way he looked at her now, fully, without restraint, the way she'd spent her first weeks at Blackstone learning to trust, and had finally simply allowed herself to need. "Come sit down," he said. "I want to go over the fence report before dark." She sat down across from him. He spread the report on the table between them, and they went through it together the way they went through everything. Each of them seeing different things, each of them saying so, the back and forth of it natural and unforced. 2 people who had long since stopped performing for each other and were simply thinking out loud in the same room. There was an argument about the cost of the north fence replacement. She thought he was undercounting the labor. He thought she was overestimating the material. And they went back and forth on it for about 10 minutes before arriving at a number that was between what each of them had said, which was usually where they landed. She did not think their life together was perfect. She would not have wanted it to be, because she had learned that perfection in a life is a sign that someone is hiding the real parts, and she was done with hiding. What they had was real. It was difficult in the places life is difficult and good in the places life is good, and the good was not despite the difficulty but because of it, earned through it, made more solid by it, the way the east barn wall was stronger in the rebuilt sections than it had been before the collapse. She thought about the people who had looked at her whole life and seen a problem, a burden, a weight to be shifted from one set of hands to another. She thought about how certain they had been, how casually, completely certain that she was the lesser thing, the deficient one, the joke that the lonely rancher would regret. She thought about what it had taken. Not one dramatic moment, not a single transformation, but the accumulation of ordinary days. A calf in freezing mud, a ledger rebuilt from disorder, a door forced open against a failing frame, a letter burned in a stove, a cottonwood tree standing at a ridgeline exactly where it had always stood. The frontier did not care what you looked like. The frontier cared what you did when the east wall came down and the horses were trapped, and the temperature was 6 degrees and nobody was coming to help. The frontier cared what you did with the numbers and the animals and the bad seasons and the people who told you that you were not enough for it. She had been enough for it, more than enough. And the knowing of that, not the proving of it to anyone else, but the interior knowledge, solid and quiet and entirely her own, was something that her father's voice and her sister's whispers and the laughing townsfolk of Carlisle had never managed to put in her and never could have because it couldn't be given. It had to be found in the doing. She found it here, in mud and cold and wood smoke and ledgers, and a man who had looked at her across a platform and seen something worth walking toward. That evening, after the fence report was done and the supper dishes were washed and the lamp was burning its quiet, steady burn against the dark, Rowan said, "Walk with me." They went out to the porch. The night was cold and clear, the kind of clear that only happens at high elevation, the stars extraordinary in their number and proximity. The yard was quiet, the bunkhouse lit from within, the barn dark and settled. She stood beside him and looked up. "You ever get used to the sky out here?" she said. "No," he said. "I stopped trying." She looked at the mountains, dark shapes against the lesser dark of the night sky, and she thought, "This is mine." Not in the legal sense, though that was true too. In the bone and blood sense, the sense that mattered. The place that had made room for exactly who she was and asked nothing different of her. Rowan put his arm around her. She leaned into him. Not because she needed to be held up, she had never needed that, but because there was a difference between needing and wanting, and she had spent so long denying herself the second that she'd almost forgotten it existed. She wanted this. She let herself have it. "Rowan," she said, "I'm glad your letter found me." He was quiet for a moment. She felt him breathe. "I wrote 6 drafts," he said, "threw 5 of them out." She turned to look at him. What was wrong with the first 5? Too much explaining, too much justifying. He looked at the mountains. "The 6th one I just said what I needed. Capable woman, working partnership, honest terms." He paused. "I didn't know what I was actually asking for." "Neither did I," she said. "When I answered." "Do you know now?" She thought about it. Not because she didn't know, but because she wanted to say it right. Not prettily, but accurately. "I know that I came here with nothing except the ability to work," she said. "And that turned out to be enough. More than enough. And I know that I found a man who looked at that and saw something worth having, not something to be tolerated." She paused. "And I know that for the first time in my life, being exactly who I am is the right answer. Not in spite of anything, because of everything." He looked at her. His face in the starlight was the face she knew best in the world now. The scar, the lines, the dark eyes that held more than they showed and showed more than they used to. "That's what I was trying to say in that 6th draft, he said. "I know," she said. "I understood it when you wrote it." He pulled her closer. She let him. The cold was considerable and neither of them moved to go inside. Below them, Blackstone was quiet and whole and entirely real. The house and the barns and the mended fences and the North Creek flowing undisputed through the upper pasture and the herd settled in for the night and the books balanced and the spring coming again, as it always came, as it would keep coming. She was 29 years old. She had been called a burden and a joke and too much and not enough, and every word of it had been wrong, and the wrongness of it had never depended on anyone else's recognition to be true. It had always been wrong. She had simply needed a place to stand where the truth of it could finally be seen clearly. She had found that place. She was not going anywhere. The stars burned cold and bright above Wyoming, and beneath them 2 imperfect, weathered, genuinely fortunate people stood on a porch in the dark and held on to each other, and the night was long and they were in no hurry, and the morning would come with all its work and difficulty and ordinary grace, as it always did, as it always would, and they would meet it together. That was enough.